From the shadows of forgotten histories emerges one of the most unfortunate narratives of the Space Marine legions, that of the Thousand Sons. Once recognized as the 15th Legion and led by their formidable Primarch, Magnus the Red, this legion embraced a destiny that diverged sharply from their original predetermined path. During the climactic Horus Heresy, the Thousand Sons fell to the treachery of both Tzeentch and Horus Rubricae. Tzeentch's influence seemed to shield the Thousand Sons from physical corruption and disintegration, which had plagued the Legion since near its inception. This was a profound crisis of mutation and de-evolution that would eventually best the Legion, if not taken care of. A phenomena that appeared to fulfill the capricious desires of their patron. Disturbed by these transformations, the chief sorcerer Ahriman invoked a potent spell which was intended to immunize the Thousand Sons against further warp-born distortions. And while the incantation succeeded staving off the pervasive effects of the flesh change, it inadvertently reduced all the afflicted non-psyker soldiers into nothing more than mystically animated suits of armor, barely sentient vestiges of who they once were. Only those imbued with formidable psychic powers were able to retain any true sense of cognition or self. All those who weren't would become not more than dust, bound to the wills of others. Today, significant segments of this once mighty legion exist as spectral warriors. This, along with the tragic saga of Prospero, their homeworld, further deepens the misery and toil that surrounds the once proud Thousand Sons. Once a celebrated world of unparalleled beauty and intellectual stimulation, Prospero was a refuge and a close-knit community of outcast psykers, which would have ideally sheltered them from prosecution. However, when the Battle of Prospero began and Imperial forces were deployed on the planet just at the inception point of the Horus Heresy, everything, including its ecosystems, were decimated. Its natural splendor obliterated, and almost its entire population wiped out from existence, leaving behind a ruined landscape that the Inquisition would later deem purgatus. However, the subsequent inferno scoured the planet with such relentlessness that its surface was transformed into a featureless expanse of black glass, marking an irreversible end to its former glory. In the vast records of Imperial history, few legions evoke as much unease or tragic fascination as do the Thousand Sons. Once noble warriors of the Imperium's Legio Astartes, they now serve solely as agents of Tzeentch, the god of change, manipulation, and sorcery. Though many legions betrayed the Emperor during the Horus Heresy, the Thousand Sons are uniquely defined by the widespread presence of psychic mutation within their numbers. However, these traits would not be acquired in damnation, but were there by design from the very beginning, as every current living member of the Legion is a psyker. That fact alone distinguishes them from all the other traitor legions, as in large part they shun brute strength and favor psychic warfare along with arcane knowledge, often waging their battles through sorcery and deceit rather than steel and fire, much unlike their kin in the World Eater's Legion. Their preferred weapons are not bolters, nor chainswords, but curses, hexes, and warp-born flame. In many engagements, their presence is signaled not by banners or battle cries, but by silence, followed by the collapse of reality's rules. The origin of this unnatural state that many of the non-living Thousand Sons suffer from can be traced back to an act of desperation, or perhaps hubris, by their most infamous figure, Ahriman. In the aftermath of their exile from Prospero, during the earliest phases of their fall to chaos, the chief librarian enacted the Rubric of Ahriman, a powerful and nigh irreversible sorcerer's rite. Its purpose was singular: to save the Legion from degrading mutations that were unleashed by their genetic code in something known as the flesh change. But the result was catastrophic, as every Thousand Sons Astartes who lacked significant enough psychic strength was reduced to naught but dust, their souls sealed forever within their suits of power armor. These warriors were now in essence hollowed and almost completely mindless, as they march on still haunted and animated by the echoes of the spell that saved many of them from damnation, while condemning others to a perpetual existence between life and death, a nightmare far worse than the one they had originally been forced to deal with. In contrast, the remaining sorcerers gained a further increased mastery over the warp, becoming even more terrible in their powers, arcane energies of destruction animated by chaos and directed by the Changer of Ways. Their father, Magnus the Red, is no less a figure of mystery and contradiction as the cyclopean giant with a copper-red skin tone, who is most well defined by his thirst for forbidden knowledge, which proved to be both his greatest strength and his undoing. Like his brother, was flung across the galaxy after the Primarch project was all but ended by the universe's worst mother, sending infants in incubation pods through literal hell. His vessel, if such was the thing that delivered him to Prospero, a remote world already shaped by a strong psychic influence. However, since Prospero was no ordinary world, as it was a rather isolated and veiled locale from the Imperium's prying eyes, allowed it to be a home for sorcery and exiled mystics, along with rogue scholars, humans who had actively chosen exile over persecution in the wider galaxy. Magnus was therefore raised not as an outcast, but as a prodigy, as he did not simply learn their teachings, he surpassed them, his mind a labyrinthian expanse of intellect and raw warp potential, reshaped their very understanding of sorcery, turning once fringe disciplines into a refined science of the soul. In time he would be raised not merely as a leader, but as a force unto himself. His mastery over the warp rivaled even that of the Emperor and Malcador the Sigillite, but this was in large part due to his desire for pursuing forbidden truths, and Magnus would ultimately tear a hole into realms better left undisturbed. So began the slow, inevitable descent of the legion he had once proudly led. Yet the question remains, were they truly victims of fate, or architects of their own ruination? Perhaps the hand of a cackling god might have had more sway than previously thought into the history of a cursed legion, one not merely cursed by betrayal, but by the very gifts that made them exceptional. As the flames of the Great Crusade would go on to consume the stars, the Emperor of Mankind found his long-lost son, Magnus, the Crimson King, upon the glass-strewn throne of Prospero. By then, Magnus had already devoured all the accumulated knowledge of his adopted homeworld and its esoteric libraries. He had become a master of the psychic arts and an adept practitioner of every forbidden scrap of lore within Prospero. Everything each and every last psychic exile had brought into the world, Magnus had absorbed. To him, truth was not a doctrine to be obeyed, but a force to be mastered. And when the Emperor arrived, Magnus would not kneel in blind faith. He saw before him the one being whose psychic might would ever eclipse his own. In that moment, a rare alignment of ambition and purpose occurred. The father offered the command of a legion, and a son accepted. Thus, Magnus assumed leadership of the Thousand Sons, warriors crafted from his own genetic stock, and he joined the ranks of the Great Crusade. With the strength of his warriors and the force of his sorcery, he carved a path across the stars in the name of unity. To many worlds, the Thousand Sons brought enlightenment and liberation. To others, confusion and dread. But always they brought knowledge, and sometimes that would be too much. Yet beneath the surface of that grand campaign, tensions brewed, as the Imperium of Man was conceived not as a pantheon of God, but as a realm of triumph for reason. Its guiding principle was the Imperial truth, a rejection of all things superstition, mysticism, and religious dogma. The Emperor's iterators carried this creed everywhere they thought, to every world they brought compliance to, stamping out all the cults and the divinations of old. But the contradiction at the heart of this doctrine was clear to Magnus, the Emperor himself. The embodiment of rationality was also the greatest psyker in the galaxy, and Magnus, his most gifted of sons, had built an entire legion upon this very paradox. As psychic phenomena surged across the Imperium, growing more and more frequent, alongside of its increasing volatility, the contradictions could not be ignored. Though the psykers themselves remained rather rare, compared to the population at large, their numbers were increasing at an exponential rate. These emerging powers defied rational classification, eluding even the most rigorous attempts at empirical analysis, and with every unexplained manifestation, fear would take root. It was at this point that the Imperium faced a question that it could not avoid. Should psychic powers be embraced as the next step of human evolution, or as a feared gateway into oblivion? To resolve this crisis, the Emperor summoned a conclave of Imperial scholars, commanders, and his highest-ranking officials, which were to include many of the Primarch, to the ice-covered world of Nicaea. There, at the council that would bear the planet's very name, both sides would lay out their arguments. Those who viewed psychic powers as dangerous, and indeed heretical, urged prohibition. Their concern was not merely metaphysical, but practical, as many believed that the warp was too treacherous, and that sorcery was an easy vector for corruption, and then it would be Magnus who would speak in the defense of the psychic arts. He, along with Jagatai Khan and Sanguinius, would be the primary members who opposed the banning of psykers, and Magnus would speak both charismatically and with a razor-sharp wit that would exemplify his intellect and his magnanimous rhetoric. The Crimson King would thereby address the council with clarity and conviction as he dismantled the opposition's arguments point by point, asserting that knowledge itself was not strictly evil, that its worth lay in how it was applied. To wield the warp, he claimed, was not an invitation to ruin, but a test of discipline. To deny humanity its potential out of fear was to place a blindfold on destiny itself. His defense swayed many, and for a moment, a gleaming, glorious moment, it seemed that the council might rule in his favor for the use of exploration of controlled psychic disciplines. But the final judgment did not hinge on rhetoric alone. The Emperor had enthroned his solemn authority and weight not only in the words spoken, but in the truth behind them. For Magnus had not merely studied the warp, instead he had bargained with its denizens, and this was despite the Emperor explicitly commanding him not to do so. This left the Emperor already burdened by the dangers he alone could not fully understand. He had warned his son, Magnus, who in turn had disregarded those warnings, and the trust between them had been fractured. In the end, in no small part due to the Space Wolves' intervention and hypocrisy, the verdict was cast, and the use of psychic powers, and particularly, most of all, sorcery, was to be strictly forbidden amongst the legions of Astartes. The Librarius Division, which had been the pet project of Magnus the Red, Sanguinius, and Jagatai Khan, would be disbanded. Magnus here had not just lost the argument, but the Emperor's very favor. What followed set the stage for one of the Imperium's most grievous betrayals. A rift, not merely of the mind or philosophy. What had begun as doctrinal change would eventually become dogma. Following the Council of Nicaea, the Emperor's verdict was clear. The use of psychic powers would be bound under unbelievably rigid limitations, with all forms of ritualistic invocation and arcane practice, along with combat sorcery, outlawed entirely. For the Thousand Sons, whose martial and philosophical identity was inseparable from their psychic disciplines, this decree was a blow of suffocating finality. Magnus the Red, proud, brilliant, and now wounded, was outraged. The tools that had once won him victory time and time again were now condemned as heresy, in no small part to the ideals of two of his brothers, Mortarion and the Wolf King, Leman Russ. Outwardly, the Great Crusade marched on, but beneath the surface, deception festered. Magnus did not comply. Instead, he withdrew from scrutiny and continued his arcane studies in secret. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge did not falter on his part, but rather it intensified, as the Thousand Sons, once champions of enlightenment, were now viewed with deep suspicion and disdain. Amongst the Primarchs, none harbored more contempt for Magnus than Leman Russ of the Space Wolves. To Russ, war was a matter of strength, honor, and direct action. He saw Magnus's sorcery as treachery in slow motion, guile masquerading as genius. Even after Nicaea, the divide between the legions deepened into an open secret of smoldering hatred. Then would come the breaking point. In the shadowed hours before the full revelation of Horus's outright betrayal, Magnus experienced a psychic vision unlike any before. The veil of time and space was torn asunder, and he was torn from his mind's eye. He saw the future unfold, legions at war, Primarchs turned against one another, worlds burned in the name of ancient gods. He witnessed the Ultramarines misled, drawn from the heart of the conflict, and above all, he saw the Emperor isolated, betrayed, and vulnerable. But for all his might, one truth eluded him, his own place in the catastrophe to come. Magnus then made a choice, to warn the Emperor at all costs, and to do so he would commit an act that in itself violated every sentence of Nicaea. Knowing full well the cost of the act, he charged in headlong, proud as always. Using his prodigious psychic might, rather than any form of communication, Magnus projected his essence across the warp, bypassing all mortal distances, and shattered the psychic seals surrounding the Imperial Palace. His spirit crossed the threshold of the Emperor's sanctum forcibly to deliver his warning, and in doing so, he exposed a far greater danger. For within that breach, something ancient stirred. The psychic shock of Magnus's intrusion tore a rent through the defenses guarding the Emperor's greatest secret undertaking, the Webway Project. This immense endeavor was an attempt to create a human-accessible pathway through the dimension that the Aldari knew as a webway, and the stable pathway was completely destabilized in a single moment, and this damage was so catastrophic that the demonic forces were able to surge through the breach. The gateway to Terra was now compromised, and the Emperor's judgment was immediate and absolute. The order was given. The Space Wolves, the Emperor's executioners and lapdogs, were dispatched off to Prospero. Officially, their task was to apprehend Magnus and bring him to the throne world to answer for his transgressions. But the reality of what would happen would be far bloodier, as the War Master Horus, already corrupted and conspiring against the Emperor, manipulated the mission's intent by merely telling Leman Russ that the Emperor instead wanted Magnus dead, and under his influence, the Space Wolves fell onto Prospero at the first chance they had to enact their judgment onto their brothers, not as emissaries of justice, but as predators sent to kill. What followed was not the sanctioned arrest, but rather a perversion of a direct order from the Emperor, one which would lead to an annihilation. The very burning of Prospero was not an execution, it was an extinction-level purge. The Thousand Sons fought to preserve their world, their legacy, their truth. But against the wrath of Fenris, backed up by the Sisters of Silence, the most formidable force that directly answered to the Emperor, and Valdor's own cadre of custodians, even they could not stand unbroken. The minds of gods are not for mortals to know or to judge. Accept that Tzeentch has a place for all of us in his grand scheme, and be happy in the part that you have to play. This was attributed to Magnus the Red. When the Council of Nicaea had settled and the writ of the Emperor was handed down, there remained only one path forward, compliance or consequences. Magnus the Red chose to see a third path, the so-called City of Light. Sika, once the pinnacle of psychic inquiry and arcane architecture, it had stood as a defiant jewel within Prospero, that is, until the Space Wolves arrived. Brother turned against brother in a climactic siege where savage clashed against scholar. The feral fury of Fenris unleashed upon the mystics of Prospero, and for a time Magnus had lowered the shields, believing this was his penance for his mistakes. However, at the crescendo of the devastation, Magnus and Russ met blade to blade, as the battlefield bore witness to a conflict that was as much ideological as it was physical. At the end, Leman Russ, an embodiment of raw martial force, broke Magnus's back upon bended knee. Yet at the brink of his defeat, Magnus uttered a single, shrouded word. In that instant, both he and the ruins of Zika vanished from the physical realm. What followed defied natural order. Magnus transported his shattered legion and their broken home into the imperium itself, and from the ashes of Prospero emerged something new within the Eye of Terror, on a world named Sorcerers, the planet of the Sorcerers. Even before their fall, the Thousand Sons had struggled against a corruption known as mutation, an inheritance of the Primarch's own perilous, unstable genetics. Rigid discipline and ceaseless gene purification rituals had once held the degradation at bay, but their immersion into the raw forces of chaos stripped away any and all safeguards, and mutation surged unrestrained. The Legion began to unravel before the very eyes of those who adored it so, its warriors devolving into monstrous parodies of themselves. Desperate to halt this ceaseless decline, a cabal of senior sorcerers, led by Chief Librarian Ahriman, devised a solution, a ritual of staggering power designed to strip the Legion's physical corruption and preserve their minds and strength. Magnus, who at this point had become increasingly withdrawn and consumed by bitterness, offered no resistance or even guidance. From his obsidian tower, he looked outwards, as the cabal proceeded without sanction or reprimand. Thus was the Rubric of Ahriman, and the warp itself answered. The skies above Sorcerers split with an etheric fury. Warp lightning clawed down from the rolling heavens, striking every battle brother one by one, as the spell unfolded with terrifying precision, bypassing psychic souls and targeting what it saw as the flawed flesh of non-psykers. But salvation gave way to horror. For those not highly attuned with the warp, the cost was absolute, as their bodies were rendered to dust, incinerated within their sealed power armor. What remained was not liberation, but imprisonment, as now soulless automata, bound to suits of ceramite, yet animated by the force, not of will, but of the Changer of Ways' own damnable skills. The rubric did indeed halt mutation, but at a devastating price. When Magnus emerged from seclusion, he beheld what had become of his sons, and at this he offered no wrath, no immediate vengeance. Instead he turned away, ascending higher into his silver tower, and cast a gaze not upon his legion, but upon the imperium he once sought to preserve. His dream, his pursuit of enlightenment, and even his desire for mastery of the warp had been turned to ashes, and to this day it is said that Magnus broods still, his true self unreachable within the highest spire, his sights sweeping across the stars, while he schemes, his sorcerers now leading the Rubricae across a galaxy, enacting the will of Tzeentch in 1,000 subtle campaigns against the Imperium. Each incursion, each incantation is but a fragment of a plan only one being may fully comprehend. It is said that even to this day, periodically Magnus the Red will appear in the Materium to either carry out his own grand designs and schemes, much like his new patron, or to attempt to get revenge on his brother by proxy through attacking the Space Wolves, or even to duel against his brother Guilliman. The knowledge of sorcery is like seawater. The more one drinks, the greater the thirst, and the more inevitable the poison. This quote was attributed to a space wolf. We now return to the beginning, before Prospero, before Magnus, before the Rubric. The tale of the Thousand Sons does not begin in the stars, but beneath the clouded skies of old Earth, Terra herself, amidst the resurgence of the warp-born unrest. It is here, during the closing days of the Unification War, that the 15th Legion was conceived. In a rare and troubling phenomena, the Sol system at this time had been racked with brief but violent warp storms, psychic flashpoints that targeted and ignited multiple segments of the world across Terra's surface, heralding a wave of madness, violence, and self-terminations. While the precise connection between them and the Thousand Sons remains unknown and unproven, it was under these circumstances and these conditions that the gene seed of the 15th Legion was first conceived. Years later, Magnus the Red, newly reunited with his sons, would learn of this timing and consider it a dire omen. The Legion's earliest aspirants, referred to in recovered data fragments as student aspirants, were selected not from the devastated war zones of Terra, but from a region formerly known as the Achaemenid Empire. This territory had weathered the unification wars with minimal damages, having submitted to Imperial rule early on, nearly a century prior. The Emperor himself personally visited the region multiple times, accompanied by a retinue of servants and gene scientists. Every family in the area was tested for compatibility with the nascent 15th Legion's genetic code. Amongst those found suitable were Chaos and Rubric of Ahriman. Those who were selected would be relocated to the Himalayan mountains, into deep gene laboratories controlled by the nascent Imperium. There, the transformation from man to Astartes began. Upon their emergence, the first duty of the Thousand Sons was not to conquer empires amongst the stars, but the cleansing of the last remnants of defiance upon Terra. Their performance was swift, brutal, and rather effective. It was said that the name Thousand Sons was granted to them by the Emperor himself, and perhaps it was not merely symbolic, as records suggest that exactly 1,000 Astartes were initially created and trained before the Legion was expanded to full strength. The reason for this precise number remains unknown, but its reputation throughout the Legion's history, particularly in their darkest moments, suggests an ominous pattern, as if fate or something deeper had etched the number into the very soul and core of the Legion. The first 1,000 were not simply warriors, as it seems that from the outset the Legion's nature was set apart from its peers. While all Legions bore characteristics derived from their gene sire and their culture, the 15th was profoundly shaped by an intrinsic affinity for the arcane. Psykers, rarities amongst most Legions, barring two, were not anomalies within the Thousand Sons, but rather the norm. Theirs was a culture of scholarship, occult practices, and structured mysticism. This reliance on psychic powers would mark the Legion as one rather fierce and beyond normal measure. It would also make them highly suspect and instill upon a few legions a profound, almost biological hate. The Imperium, then still in its nascent golden age, tolerated sorcery only so long as it remained useful. In time, the same arts that made the Thousand Sons invaluable would also provoke censure, fear, and retribution. But in the early days, the Thousand Sons were not yet damned, neither by fate nor by their kin. They were the Emperor's chosen scholars, warriors of the mind as well as the sword, carrying his light into the darkest corners of the galaxy. Their destiny, however, was already moving against them, far beyond the heart of the Imperium. On the galactic fringe, where the light of Terra had long since dimmed, there lay a world chosen not for its beauty. This was Prospero, originally a barren sun-scorched husk orbiting a faded star. Prospero was devoid of natural appeal. It was isolated, scarred, and by all conventional standards, inhospitable. But it was precisely these qualities that drew its earliest settlers. These were not conquerors or colonists, but rather outcasts, mutants, psykers, and the psychically attuned, who had been pushed to the fringes of humanity's expanding reach, fleeing persecution and the fleeing wrath of a fearful humanity. They sought a refuge where they could live, study, and evolve in peace. On Prospero they had found it. At the center of this forgotten world rose a marvel, seemingly out of place amidst such desolation: the city of Zika, also known as the City of Light. Built atop the planet's most prominent mount, Zika was an architectural marvel and the revelation of white marble towers, radiant spires, and pyramidal libraries, alongside luminous obelisks, all which stretch outward into the skies above. It thrived through techno-psychic energies and subterranean hydroponics, designed to sustain a people who lived not by brute force, but by intellect and arcane mastery. Here, the traditions of psychic study matured into elite disciplines, structured, revered, and crucially sacred. Amongst these seekers of knowledge, one figure would stand apart: a child not born of the world, but delivered onto it. Over time, this being rose from a curious prodigy into an unraveled master, and his name was Magnus. From the beginning, Magnus the Red displayed abilities beyond comprehension. His intellect and his psychic talent were vast, along with being set apart due to his towering body, which would be considered tall even amongst giants. Under the twin sons of Prospero, he became a scholar, a protector, and a philosopher king. His evolution was not merely a personal journey, but one mirrored by Prospero itself. As he grew, so too did Zika flourish into a beacon of learning and psychic discipline. Then, in a moment foretold by dreams and visions, a presence emerged from the void. This was the Emperor of Mankind. Radiating golden light, he stepped upon Prospero's soil, and what transpired that day has never been recorded in full. Some say there were no words, only mutual recognition between a father and son. Others say a battle of ungodly psychic might happened within the Imperium. A test, if you will. What is known for certain is that Magnus acknowledged that he was one of 20 lost Primarch, and his origin confirmed his destiny. In that moment, the tapestry of the Thousand Sons Legion was in essence completed, as the 15th Legion, already marked by an extraordinary psychic potential, had found its progenitor. Magnus would then swiftly take command of those who bore his gene seed, and with his guidance, their powers would intensify greatly. What had been rare amongst Astartes had become almost commonplace. Sorcerers, scholars, warriors, all shaped in Magnus's crimson image. Thus, the Thousand Sons truly became his legion, not only in flesh, but in mind and spirit alike. But beneath the brilliance of Prospero's towers and reunion, a question remained. Was Prospero merely a sanctuary, or rather, was it a testing ground? Did Magnus rise to power, or was he always meant to be found? This is a paradoxical nature that follows the Thousand Sons, even to this day. Are they merely victims of fate, or was there a greater architect in their downfall? Are they truly free men and free thinkers, or like slaves, do they obey? It is not granted, it is taken, shaped, and imposed upon the world. Those who refuse its weight are doomed to be consumed by it. Observational fragment recovered from the Beotan campaign. As the thunder of the Unification Wars drew to a close, Hera stood trembling on the very threshold of rebirth, with one final fire remaining to be quenched. It burned rather stubbornly in the southeastern sprawl of what ancient cartographers called the Beotan lowland. It was here at around 798 M30 that the Emperor of Mankind turned his gaze towards a nation that had long resisted his dominion, Beota, a relic of the Age of Strife. Beota had survived on martial tradition and arcane governance. Insulated by its rugged terrain and fiercely loyal population, the ruling dynasty had remained obstinate in the face of Terra's reformation and reunification, refusing to yield their sovereignty even as the stars began to awaken to the Emperor's call. The Imperium's patience, already stretched thin due to centuries of conflict, had reached its end, and what followed would be the final, decisive hammer blow of the Unification War. The 15th Legion, recently forged and still untested on the broader warfront, was then deployed to crush Beota's resistance. These warriors, soon to be known as the Thousand Sons, were not yet the arcane masters that they would one day be, but even in these early days, they bore the marks of brilliance. As the Imperial army moved to engage the outer territories, it was the Astartes of the 15th who descended upon the heart of Beotan in a lightning campaign that would leave Imperial historians stunned for centuries to come. 6 weeks, that is all it took. In less than 2 lunar cycles, the Yeseti dynasty had been extinguished. The Botan military apparatus, ritualistic, stubborn, and hopelessly outdated, was dismantled with precise finality. Every act of defiance was met with a calculated measure of force. Every stronghold was breached with surgical speed. For the 15th Legion, this was not simply a campaign, it was a proving ground, and they emerged from it not only victorious, but transformed. The successful pacification of Beota marked a turning point. Shortly after the smoke cleared, the Emperor himself bestowed upon the Legion its enduring name, the Thousand Sons. It was a title born of both distinction and a grim omen. Its origin actually was tied, as we've previously established, to the strange numerical beginnings of the Legion's formation. From there, the newly appointed Thousand Sons were granted their own expeditionary fleet, and they were summarily dispatched into the stars. As the Era era of the Great Crusade had truly begun, and with it the next chapter in the Legion's evolution. It was 5 standard years into the Great Crusade, and the 15th Legion, the recently named Thousand Sons, stood as paragons of Imperial progress. What began as promising martial formations soon revealed themselves to have rather defining characteristics that would elevate and ultimately imperil the very Legion. A widespread and escalating emergence of psychic phenomena. Initially, these powers were viewed with cautious optimisms, as the Thousand Sons believed their gift to be a reflection of the Emperor's own example. His mastery over the imperium mirrored in their genetic inheritance. Though apparently reluctant, the Emperor permitted their use of these abilities, recognizing the strategic utility in the ever-expanding war for galactic reunification. As long as the results benefited the Imperium, discretion was granted, and the results themselves were undeniable. Rather than engaging in prolonged sieges and attritional warfare, the Thousand Sons waged a war of the mind. Entire planetary populations were subdued through manipulation and thought. Psychic coercion, along with war-born illusions, were also tools in the repertoire. In many cases, compliance was achieved with minimal to no bloodshed. But this method of conquest was so at odds with the doctrines of the other legions, to the point it drew ire from traditionalists. Chief amongst them was Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, whose contempt for subtlety and sorcery had already been well documented. To Russ, there was no honor in conquest without battle, no glory without the clash of steel. The Thousand Sons, in his eyes, walked a path devoid of a warrior's virtue. Yet it was not external condemnation that brought crisis to the Legion. Rather, it was a transformation from within. Without warning, members of the Legion began to undergo grotesque and horrifying mutations. These weren't physical aberrations, but catastrophic reconfigurations of the Astartes' very forms. Limbs twisted into monstrous shape, flesh sheathed with unnatural growth, minds unraveled and unmade. The Thousand Sons came to know this condition as the flesh change. At first, it was isolated and sporadic, with the cases being uncommon enough that they could quarantine and safely study them. But it spread at a terrifying, nigh uncalculable speed, as entire squads, then companies, would succumb. Those affected were either put down or placed in stasis, sealed in hopes of an eventual cure being found. In a matter of years, the Thousand Sons' numbers had once again plummeted to that of near extinction. Then salvation would arrive from the stars. The Great Crusade reached the remote world of Prospero, where the Legion was at last reunited with their long-lost gene-sire, Magnus the Red. Upon his arrival, the flesh change had already reached pandemic levels. Yet Magnus, prodigious and powerful, acted swiftly, employing methods and knowledge never previously recorded or even known to the current Imperial archives, as he intervened directly, halting the mutations and purging the instability, preserving what remained of his sons. The cost, however, was staggering. When the process concluded, only 1,000 warriors remained. The name Thousand Sons, once symbolic, had for a second time become quite literal. With their gene seeds stabilized, Magnus turned Prospero into a haven for psychic study and began the process of recruitment and reconstruction. Though their numbers were never able to match those of the larger legions, the Thousand Sons returned to the galaxy with their strength restored in both flesh and mind, ready for the Great Crusade. And with Magnus at their helm, they did not just conquer, they transformed. Entire systems were brought into Imperial compliance, not through devastation, but through domination of will and vision. Where others raised cities from rubble, the Thousand Sons preserved, instructed, and enlightened. As the Great Crusade surged onwards into the darker frontiers of the galaxy, the Thousand Sons adapted their strategy with calculated precision, and where brutal force failed, the 15th Legion relied on cunning manipulation and their unparalleled mastery of the imperium. Diplomacy, psychological warfare, and illusions born from psychic powers became the foundation of much of their success. In the early campaigns, this approach was tolerated and perhaps even admired by the broader Imperium, but this tolerance would not last. When expeditionary fleets of the Thousand Sons pushed into the lawless void, they encountered enemies unlike any others, Xenos and human creatures alike, who wielded psychic forces in defiance of Imperial sanction and allotments. In these new and uncharted theaters, deception alone could not secure compliance, and war was inevitable, leading the Thousand Sons, ever adaptive, to meet war with militarized sorcery. Where others raised bolter and blade, they summoned storms of fire and rent thought from flesh, bending the very warp to their will. Worlds fell to compliance or into oblivion beneath the relentless weight of their psychic might. But with every such victory came renewed levels of scrutiny. Rumblings of discontent began to circle amongst the Primarchs. To some, these psyker legionaries were not warriors, but rather liabilities. As a silent question grew louder, said question was as follows: should such power be allowed to persist within the Emperor's legions? However, this question found no immediate answer, but events soon rendered the quest for an answer unavoidable. The genocide of Kamikina Troika was fought in the late 900s of M30, and it stands as one of the Thousand Sons' most brutal campaigns. The system had been overrun by orcs who were brutal, feral, and utterly unrelenting. The Emperor himself issued a writ of complete extermination, mobilizing not only the 15th, but also a colossal series of god engines from Legio Astrum and the genetically augmented infantry of the Pan-Pac Eugaeans, and their objective was beyond simple to surmise: purge the greenskins from the triad of satellite worlds orbiting Kameka Uzilra, a vital holding claimed by the Mechanicum of Mars. This war, despite its scale, lasted but a mere 2 standard years, and it was a campaign not of glory but of attrition. Every inch of ground was earned with fire, blood, and psychic agony. While victory was ultimately secured, it came at a staggering cost. The Thousand Sons alone lost 873 battle brothers from their storied 5th Fellowship, rendering this single combat grouping all but extinct. The losses forced a rather painful decision upon Magnus the Red. The Legion, once organized into 10 fellowships, was restructured into the Presergic, the 9 traditional divisions of Prosperan lore. This was a symbolic act, but also one of necessity, as the 5th Fellowship, once a proud pillar of the Legion's martial identity, ceased to be a functional and or even operational units. Banners from Kimeka Torika might have been soaked in victory, but there came a silence with said accomplishment, and the whispers continued as some began to question, had the powers that made the Thousand Sons so effective also ensured that they would never truly belong with the greater Imperium and continue to suffer such staggering losses. During the final century of the Great Crusade, the 28th Expeditionary Fleet of the Thousand Sons discovered a seemingly unremarkable star system, a cluster of lifeless planets orbiting a dying sun. But the 5th world, designated Argu, would become a subject of deep intrigue and later growing concern by the broader Imperium. Argu was home to a primitive, isolated human culture, intact yet untouched by advanced science or even any form of real industry. Despite their developed state, the local population willingly submitted to imperial control and were officially designated 2816. And this was achieved without bloodshed, as the compliance itself was a diplomatic success rather than anything greater. Yet it was what lay beneath the surface that drew the attention of Primarch Magnus the Red. The Argu people preserved histories of ancient beings called the Elohim, figures bearing a striking resemblance to what Imperial soldiers might refer to as the Eldari. Within the tales, there was also mention of a corrupt being known as the Shithai, a dark hedonistic entity born from the Elohim's excess and imprisoned beneath the vast mountains at the edge of a salt flat valley. The structure itself was referred to by the Thousand Sons as the Mountain, and it dwarfed Olympus Mons back on Mars, along with, curiously enough, being an artificial construct. Surrounding the mountain, there were monolithic stones known as the Dead Stones, each towering higher than 3 men stacked upon each other. These ancient constructs were later confirmed to be psychic dampeners, placed there to suppress the warp energies radiating from the peak. Whether it was crafted by the Argu, the Elohim, or some other ancient race is theretofore unknown. Magnus, enthralled by the structure and its lore, entered the mountain and uncovered what would be described as a conceptual web a gateway network of incomprehensible scale. Billions of potential conduits between worlds that spanned this hidden architecture. However, Argu's node had long since been corrupted by the warp and sealed from further access to attempt to contain the spread of chaos. It should have ended there, but fate seemed to have other plans. Captain Kofas of the 6th Fellowship, whose intent remains in great dispute, struck one of the Guardian constructs, which bore a particular similarity to Eldar Titans. The results were rather catastrophic, as the dormant forces within the mountain identified this action as potentially demonic in origin, and thanks to that, they were roused from their long slumber. The Titans, once inert, now moved with malice, and their attacks were both swift and brutal. In the chaos that followed, the Thousand Suns found themselves overwhelmed. Yet the tides would be turned with the unexpected arrival of the Space Wolves' 5th Great Company, led by Jarl Ashmodai Garrison's son, returning from a campaign upon the Arc Cluster. Despite their initial tension, born from Magnus's irritation at the 6 legions' baroque demands, the 2 legions fought side by side unbelievably effectively. And thanks to this, the Titans were banished through a combination of strength and the might of both legions. In the aftermath, Magnus finally acknowledged the aid that the Space Wolves had provided them, offering the deference his son's cousins had earned in battle. And with the gate sealed once more, Magnus and his legion bound for the broader Imperium would suffer from the war erupting in the Arc Reach cluster. At the cusp of the 31st millennium, the Arc Reach cluster emerged as one of the most fiercely contested regions of the late Great Crusade. Discovered by the 47th Expeditionary Fleet of the Wordbearers, the Arc Reach cluster was a volatile convergence of binary stars and independent planetary empires. Each system in the cluster rejected the Imperium's offer of compliance, and what followed was not diplomacy, but fire and brimstone raining from the very skies. The initial phases of the compliance campaigns were swift and uncompromising. The first 4 systems fell beneath the relentless assault of the Wordbearers and the Space Wolves, 2 legions whose doctrines widely diverged, but whose shared sense of purpose made them a devastating duo of conquerors. Unleashed a campaign of utter and complete annihilation, the Wordbearers' Ashen Circle hunted down cultural relics and incinerated them, along with libraries, temples, and individuals with any scrap of knowledge that the Imperium would deem a false doctrine. The last 2 worlds, Arc Reach Secundus and its twin, the icebound world that would come to be known as Shrike, just refused to yield. On Secundus, high in the frozen peaks of Heliosa, the Avians held out within their silver towers. These formidable defenders, whose origins remain somewhat obscured within Imperial records, delayed the Crusade's completion and, most hurtful to the Space Wolves, triggered the call for reinforcement. That call was answered by Magnus the Red and his 1,000 Sons, who had recently departed from the compliance campaign at Argu, and it was Leman Russ himself who dispatched the summons. Despite the simmering tensions between the 6th and the 15th, Russ recognized that Heliosa's mysteries and Shrike's defenses required not force but intellect and guile, and that's where Magnus came in. However, this alliance would not be one of mutual understanding, as when the 1,000 Sons arrived, they found a campaign already in brutal motion. The Space Wolves had favored immediate relentless strikes, maintaining momentum and unflinchingly keeping pressure upon their opponents. The 1,000 Sons, by contrast, preferred precision and psychic reconnaissance along with strategic discretion. These doctrines seemed to clash and result in large amounts of animosity. However, none of this was more evident than on the bloody attrition upon Shrike, a world that earned its name from the skies. Imperial forces on Shrike had been relentlessly assaulted by flocks of hostile razor-beaked avians, identified by the local population as snow shrikes. These predators tore through the exposed infantry, disrupted aerial deployment, and forced reconfiguration of Imperial arsenals towards point defense weaponry, constantly being aimed at the swarms in the very skies, rather than being implemented on battles against the planet's populace. What begun as a mission of compliance became a test of endurance, and for the 1,000 Sons, it would be a reckoning. It was on Shrike that the flesh change would return. Once thought dormant or even cured, the dreaded mutagenic curse erupted once more amongst the 15th Legion. Marines fell into uncontrollable mutations, their forms twisting beyond recognition, and in the midst of battle, they would be seen changing. To the Space Wolves, who had been long suspicious of their cousin's sorcery, this was a confirmation of their deepest fears and perhaps desires, as it allowed them to refer to the Thousand Sons as impure, unclean, and damned. The final compliance of the Arc-Reach cluster would be secured, but realistically at what cost, since at Heliosa's end, Russ would confront Magnus, and this would be because as the campaign across the Arc-Reach cluster neared its conclusion, it was the Thousand Sons who delivered the final precise stroke. At the Battle of Raven's Era 93, which was a key stronghold overlooking the ice-locked valleys of Shrike, which, much to the embarrassment of the Space Wolves, was won in a mere few hours, with extremely light casualties, all thanks to the 15th Legion's coordination and foresight, directed by the Corvidae cult, being what led the Imperial forces to have the ability to strike surgically. Through their presence, the hidden movements of the avian commanders were revealed and swiftly punished. Space Wolf strike teams executed the survivors in brutal close quarters combat, while Wordbearers fire teams cleansed the last holdout in holy flame. Victory, however, brought no unity, as tensions had been simmering and they reached their breaking point amidst the ruins of Phoenix Crag, Shrike's capital city. Here, Magnus the Red was appalled by what he saw: the burning of settlements and the execution of non-combatant civilians. To Magnus, this was no longer compliance. It was butchery of men, women, and children who had not been involved in any of the combat. However, to Leman Russ, what the Crimson King called a genocide, the Space Wolves merely saw as justice. The avians had defied the Imperial truth, clung to their beliefs, and due to their leadership and their combatants spilled Imperial blood. In Russ's eyes, their sentence had been passed the moment their leadership chose resistance. Then came the spark. As verbal barbs turned into open threats, several Fenrisian warriors broke ranks and charged. The Thousand Sons, unwilling to be cowed, met force with sorcery. As bolts of psychic lightning lanced across the field, Fenrisian wolves were felled mid-pounce. Warriors of the 6th Legion collapsed, permanently crippled by nervous system failures induced through psychic precision. And then it happened. Amongst the 15th Legion stood Hustar, a Phione psyker of notable skill. In the chaos of battle, against what in all rights would be a traitorous assault from the Space Wolves, he overextended his power. The flesh change, long thought dormant, returned in full. His form twisted, bones ruptured, and his muscles ballooned grotesquely. Others nearby recoiled at the horror as his corruption began to trigger sympathetic mutations amongst the more psychically sensitive. Panic surged through the Thousand Sons ranks as Magnus the Red stepped forward, silent and wise. He approached Hustar without fear, arms wide in a gesture of mercy. The mutated Astartes, screaming and writhing, reached out to his gene-sire. For a moment it appeared as if Magnus was about to embrace his broken son, and through said embrace hear him. And then a thunderclap emerged. A single round detonated within Hustar's chest, obliterating him in an instant. Then silence fell, followed by an echoing of a tink which was massive in the now quiet area. This was a spent shell casing which had been fired by the Wolf King. As Leman Russ strode forward without hesitation, his bolt gun still smoking. Weapons were drawn and sorcery crackled against chain blades and frost axes. Here the air grew thick and heavy with inevitability. But the bloodbath was not to come, at least not yet. This was due to the intervention of Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Wordbearers. As he stepped between them, his voice measured, commanding, and downright noble, cut through the fury. With rhetoric and orator skills honed like a blade, he quickly de-escalated what would have become the first full war between brother legions. Magnus, though calmed, refused to condone what had transpired in Heliosa. Russ, in turn, would not allow his judgment to be questioned. To him, his judgment was second only to the Emperor. This was his campaign, his discovery, and, by laws of conquest, his right to determine the fate of the people. The avians had chosen death, in his view, and Russ was merely meant to deliver it. As he turned to depart, he faced his brother one last time. "There will be a reckoning between us," the Wolf King growled. With ritual finality, Russ drew his blade across his palm, letting his blood spill upon the frozen ground. He then cast his head back and howled, a cry that echoed across Shrike. His warriors answered in chorus, their howls rising like funeral dregs across the ash-laced sky. This was a warning, a promise, and a curse, all in one. It's important to recognize that the Great Crusade was not without its shadowed Machiavellian plot, along with moral strife, and perhaps none loomed larger than that of the crisis brought about by the Council of Nicaea. In the aftermath of the Heliosa campaign and the increasing public rift between the Thousand Sons and their brother legions, troubling accusations began. Captain Apophis of the 5th Fellowship, veteran of the Camineka Dorica campaign, would later recall the rising scrutiny being like a slowly tightening noose. The Thousand Sons had long since held a reputation for their arcane abilities, but now whispers hardened into charges. Mutation, heresy, dangerous consorts with warp-born creatures. The most prominent of these voices came from the Death Guard, the Imperial Fist, the Raven Guard, and the Space Wolf, each harboring suspicions towards the very nature of sorcery and those who wielded it. Reports proliferated that the 15th Legion's gene seed had become unstable, that mutations were spreading unchecked, and that their powers, far from being tools of enlightenment, were gateways to corruption. Even those untainted by the flesh change were now demonstrating psychic abilities of tremendous and deeply concerning potency, what was making them appear as first among equals. As pressure mounted, these objections were carried to the Emperor. Amongst the most severe recommendations was the formal disbandment of the Thousand Sons and their erasure from Imperial records. The Emperor, though rarely swayed by political fervor, had grown increasingly disturbed by Magnus's unrestrained pursuit of occult knowledge. The Imperium, as it advanced, encountered world after world devastated by the psychic wars of the Age of Strife. The scars left by uncontrolled psykers were still very much fresh to many a world, and visible within their cultures. The fear that such ruin could repeat itself, and this time at the hands of the Legionis Astartes, was not wholly unfounded. And so, at the edge of a fault line that could fracture the Imperium itself, the Emperor summoned a gathering of extraordinary weight, which would be known as the Council of Nicaea. Held on the isolated and seismically unstable world of Nicaea, the conclave brought together the highest authorities of the Imperium, well, at least some of them. Due to political brinksmanship, some Primarchs, in particular those aligned with Magnus the Red's own belief, were unable to make it. But those who came included many a Primarch, senior commanders, administrators, scholars, even Malcador the Sigillite, regent and imperial proxy, who presided over the proceedings. At the center of the storm was Magnus the Red, who defended the use of psychic powers with unmatched eloquence. He spoke of progress, of insight, of unlocking the secrets of the universe to hasten the crusade. He argued that sorcery, properly harnessed, was not corruption, but rather salvation. His opposition was no less staunch. Leman Russ, still raw from the event of Heliosa, and his faithfuls denounced sorcery as antithetical to honor and loyalty, to the point of having one of their own befriend and beguile a Thousand Sons sorcerer, and use the information and their friendship, fake as it was, to make the Thousand Sons Primarch look bad during the conclave. Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard, testified personally, invoking grim testimonies of his youth, in particular how warp manipulation had been the tool for the tyrant and Xenos warlords that had enslaved his entire population. As arguments raged, consensus began to crystallize, unfortunately for the galaxy at large, not around Magnus, but around fear. Fear of what psykers might become. However, rune priests and those psykers of the Space Wolves would be excluded from this, and so the Emperor rendered his judgment. No punishment would be levied for past transgressions. This was because unity demanded restraint, not retribution, as much as that upset Leman Russ. But effective immediately, the use of psychic powers by Imperial military forces would be prohibited. Astartes librarians were to be stood down and reintegrated into standard battlefield roles. Only astropaths, navigators, and strictly sanctioned psykers, such as those from the Ordo Sinister, who were under the direct Imperial control of either direct commands from the Emperor, such as the aforementioned Ordo Sinister, or those serving alongside the Sisters of Silence, would retain their position. To Magnus, this decree was more than a censure. It was a rejection of the future he believed in. The Thousand Sons complied outwardly, but inwardly they turned their energies insular. In secret, they began compiling all forbidden knowledge they could recover from thousands of compliant worlds. These fragments would later be bound into a single tome. Thus, the council ended not with a purge, but with a paper shield. This ruling meant to secure the Imperium's stability, but in truth, it marked a division that would echo for centuries to come, where a moment of mistrust was written into law, and where compliance bred quiet defiance. The events that would follow Magnus directly disregarding the Edict of Nicaea in an attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal would occur around 734 M31, and it would be known as the Fall of Prospero, but to others, it would be known as the Burning Burning of Prospero, or even the Desolation of Prospero. As Prospero, the home of the 50th Legion, the Thousand Suns, had long stood as a jewel of intellect and psychic mastery, which had partly dimmed after the Emperor's decree at the Council of Nicaea. However, the Thousand Suns had not stopped their pursuit as they had delved deeper, even as they were ordered to look away, and in doing so, they drew the wrath of Terra. Officially, the Emperor had issued an order to recall the Legion and to have Magnus and the Astartes taken into custody and safely returned to Terra in disgrace. There, they would answer for their transgressions directly to him. But what followed was not sanctioned by the Emperor's hand. The blow that had struck Prospero was delivered by the Space Wolves all too willingly, having taken bluster and self-importance in their reputation as the Emperor's executioners. However, here they would not act under his order, but rather under Horus's, completely disregarding the direct commands of the God Emperor. The War Master, already deep in his treacherous designs, seized the opportunity to wedge brother against brother, as he dispatched the Space Wolf with falsified orders, some that would have been quite easy for them to see through if not blinded by their own enmity, ensuring that the Thousand Suns would be annihilated and not merely censured. With them came elements of the Legio Custodes and the silent enforcers of one of the greatest arms of military directly under the Emperor's command, the Sisters of Silence. Together they fell upon Prospero with an overwhelming force. The irony is impossible to ignore. The wolves, so often painted as brutal but loyal, seemed to not even deign questioning Horus's complete disregard of the Emperor's direct command. To them, it was the Emperor's will that they would be finally allowed to indulge in the destruction they so sought. And so they razed the shining towers of Zika and burned the soul of Prospero to ash. What they did, they believed was righteous and their nigh divinely ordained right. What they were, in the eyes of history, was deceived buffoon, clown, one of the many reasons the Horus Heresy would go as horribly as it did. One of the titles given to them by the Black Legion was the Deceived. The term not regarding their foolishness, but rather how easy it was to manipulate them into betrayal of a loyal brother. It was an epitaph given to them not purely out of mockery, but of grim recognition of the failures the Space Wolves would forever be. Even Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns foresaw what was to come. He knew the implications of defying the Edict of Nicaea in an attempt to warn his father. He knew the price his legion might pay, and still he did not prepare for battle, as he chose inaction, believing perhaps that the judgment would be measured and deserved, or perhaps that resistance would only worsen the Emperor's wrath. It is unclear if he knew specifically what was coming and acted out of pride, guilt, or fatalism, but when the orbital bombardments began, there was no defenses prepared. The Space Wolf struck with relentless fury, orbital salvos leveling entire districts, targeting civilian populations, scholars, and warriors alike, all obliterated with a rapturous fervor that speaks more of the followers of Slaanesh. What followed the bombardment would be a drop-pod assault, with a litany of descending Astartes, bringing fire, wrath, and brimstone, even that which could not fight. It was not a war, it was a purge, one which the Space Wolves would repeat with their allies on multiple occasions, marking this not as an isolated incident, but as a depiction of the Space Wolves' natural inclination. The final tragedy which would occur on that day would be a climactic battle between the two Primarchs on the shattered remnants of Prospero, where Leman Russ would meet Magnus the Red in single combat. There, amidst the flames of ruins, the Wolf King would seek to break the Cyclops, not only in body, but in spirit, as his sons attempted to slaughter every last remaining life on Prospero. However, what preceded the tragic event known as the Fall of Prospero did not begin with the battle itself, nor with the arrival of the Space Wolf, but rather it began with a rupture, a breach of trust, both personal and cosmic. When Magnus the Red first discovered the extent of Horus's betrayal, when he learned that his once loyal brother and war master had pledged himself to the ruinous powers of the warp, Magnus did not hesitate. With the full force of his psychic abilities, he reached out towards the only one he believed could stop the madness, the Emperor of Mankind. In an unprecedented act, Magnus initiated a psychic communication directly connecting with the Emperor's mind upon Terra, but the psychic backlash was immense, overwhelming the Imperium's already fragile defenses, as thousands of minds within the Imperial Palace would be shattered, their consciousnesses destroyed by the raw force of Magnus's message. However, the Emperor, deeply suspicious, was for some reason unwilling to accept the possibility of betrayal, and he refused to believe the warning, even though this might have been partly enraged due to Magnus destroying the psychic barriers he had set up in order to prevent demons from entering his webway project, which led to, in his eyes, Magnus, ever the obsessive sorcerer and psychic who had been tainted and betrayed him. The Emperor had long since been distrustful of his son's disregard for the rules and obsession with the use of psychic powers, which had not only been outlawed by the Council of Nicaea, but directly warned to Magnus by his father. To him, Magnus's current use of sorcery to destroy the webway project signaled corruption, and so the Emperor came to a grim conclusion. Magnus had been the one to turn to the Chaos God, or had been manipulated himself. In response, the Emperor issued a direct order. The Space Wolves, led by the Primarch Leman Russ, were to safely bring Magnus to Terra, where he would answer for his defiance, and the Emperor himself would deign what punishment Magnus would receive. However, what he could not have foreseen was that Horus, ever the architect of deception, had intercepted the Space Wolves and subtly told him of altered orders. These Space Wolves would no longer be tasked with retrieving Magnus and bringing him to Terra to face justice. Horus's orders had turned the retrieval and escort mission into something far darker. Something that the Space Wolves were all too giddy to act upon. The Space Wolves were commanded to launch an assault on Prospero itself, the Thousand Suns homeworld. It was then that Magnus realized it was too late and that he had been deceived. His communication with the Emperor was indeed an act of loyalty, but it had been twisted by forces far beyond his control. In desperation, Magnus attempted to make amends, believing that in doing so, he could save the majority of his legion, if not himself, from the coming disaster. He deliberately withheld any warning from the Thousand Suns, unwilling to see his son's death as part of a greater design, even if it meant sacrificing everything he stood for. The Thousand Suns fleet was also dispatched far from the world intentionally, rendering it unable to join in the combat to defend the world, but also protecting all those upon it from the reprisal that Magnus and the world would be going through. Magnus understood the true enemy was not the Space Wolves themselves, but rather Chaos, having manipulated them both. However, he also understood that the Space Wolves would take any chance to slaughter him and his sons. The attack when it came was swift and merciless, as the Space Wolves were not only joined by the Adeptus Custodes, as well as the Sisters of Silence. They launched a brutal invasion when they arrived from the warp without warning, their fleet materializing almost directly above Prospero, catching the planet's defenders unprepared. With the planet's orbital defenses obliterated, there was no way to warn anyone, and no form of preparation, just a violent, relentless assault on an army that did not know the truth of their own betrayal. The Emperor had not ordered retribution, he had ordered censure, and for the Thousand Suns to be escorted to Terra. But it was Horus, counting on the Space Wolves' eagerness, working with his cunning, guile, and manipulation, who had set the stage for Prospero's destruction. The result was not simply the fall of a planet, but the rupture of the Imperium's very fabric, and the setting of a trend that the Space Wolves would seemingly follow for millennia to come. The fate of Prospero itself was definitively sealed in a violent, decisive moment. Following the devastating orbital bombardment, which reduced much of the world to ash, Zika, the capital city and seat of Magnus the Red and his Thousand Suns Legion, stood as the last bastion of defiance and the last safe place for non-combatants. Despite the destruction on the planet's surface, Zika itself remained largely intact, shielded by a nigh impenetrable psychic void shield that protected the city from the wrath of Imperial firepower. This formidable shield was maintained by one of the Thousand Suns' secretive cults, and Magnus, though fully aware of the approaching doom, did not dare disable it. To do so would alert his legion and invite the inevitable destruction of every last living being on Prospero. Magnus knew that with the shield in place, any Imperial invasion on Zika would be costly, and indeed, this proved to be the case when the Space Wolves, along with their allies, the Adeptus Custodes and the legendary Sisters of Silence, arrived. They faced a formidable challenge, that of breaching Zika's defenses. A vast Imperial force descended from the skies, with landing craft and support vehicles flooding the city. Though they found the city's defenses mostly unarmed, the Imperial invaders swiftly established a breach within the spaceport area, and they did so with brutal efficiency, beginning their slaughter of the Prosperans, indiscriminately razing everything. However, the rank and file of the Thousand Suns, unlike their Primarch, did not accept their fate willingly. They did not see their inevitable defeat as a necessary punishment for the defiance of Magnus's wishes, and in defiance of Magnus's wishes, they rose up defended their city and the citizens within. Surprisingly enough, they managed to hold their ground against the three factions of invaders, their sorcery and unrelenting will keeping the Space Wolves at bay. Sika, the last surviving city on Prospero, became a morbid battleground and a symbol of the Legion's desperate resistance. But as the battle wore on, Magnus could no longer stand idly by. He had seen the signs of his Legion's downfall, and reluctantly he understood that this was no longer a punishment, but rather an execution. That moment came when Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, and his wolf-born monstrosities, the cursed and mutated sons of Fenris, were brought into the heart of Zika. They advanced towards the last standing pyramid of the city. This would be the site of the confrontation between two of the greatest and most powerful Primarchs. It was there that Magnus and Russ would engage in battle, and so would begin a battle of epic proportions. Sika, the capital of Prospero, burned, while the Space Wolves slaughtered all in sight. The battle between demigods would commence. Purple lightning split the sky, and the heavens darkened with the sudden fall of night. A deluge of black rain fell, soaking everything in an instant, saturating the air with the bitter taste of sodden ashes. Ahriman looked up to see a flaming giant descending from the highest reaches of the pyramid of Photep. The crux anasta rippled with a pellucid green fire, and kaleidoscopic bolts of lightning slammed into the ground, immolating dozens of cursed wolfen with every blasting strike. Cracks split the ground, and the water surrounding the pyramid seethed and boiled with anger. Black waves crashed upon the shores, and the glass shards from the pyramid were caught in a surging sentient wind that hurled them like spears to impale enemy warriors and skewer them to the ground. Ahriman felt an enormous buildup of energy and summoned all his strength to control his body, knowing the mutations within his flesh would seek to throw off the shackles of his form and unleash new and terrifying ones within him. Yet the painful surge of mutant growth never came. He looked up at the radiant being of fire and light that drew ever closer. Magnus the Red was a glorious sight, his golden armor and wild red hair ablaze with etheric energy. His bladed staff threw blinding arcs of lightning that destroyed armored vehicles in thunderous explosions. Magnus swept his eye across the horrified Space Wolves, and all those who met his gaze died in an instant, as they were driven to madness by the Stygian depths of the infinite chaos they saw there. Above Sika, madness raged as the power of the great ocean pierced the sky and became a transparent window into the realm beyond. Gibberish eyes the size of mountains and amorphous monsters, the likes of which only madmen could dream, leered down on the doomed world below. Hundreds died instantly at the sight of such blasphemous horrors. No sane man could witness such vileness without recoiling, and the invading army paused in its slaughter, shocked by the sight of such dreadful things, glaring hungrily at the world below. Even the wolfen cowered at the sight of these abominable creatures, feeling the overwhelming insignificance of their existence. Only Leman Russ and his wolf companions stood unfazed by this vision of Magnus, and Ahriman saw a gleam of anticipation in the Wolf King's eyes, as though he relished the idea of finally coming to conflict with his brother. Magnus set foot on the causeway, and the normal tempo of time slowed to a crawl, each raindrop falling as though it were in slow motion, these zigzagging traces of lightning moving with a now infinite slowness. The volcanic stone of the causeway rippled with transformative energies beneath Magnus's very feet, and Ahriman dropped to his knees before his Primarch, as centuries of ingrained obedience made the motion unconscious. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns was a divine, rapturous figure of light amidst the darkness. The gold of his armor had never been brighter, the red of his vast mane never more vivid. His flesh burned with a touch of immense power, greater than anything it had ever contained before. His eye locked into Ahriman, and at the depths of despair he saw in that haunted, glowing orb froze the blood in his veins. In that moment, Ahriman felt the horror Magnus had felt as his sons mutated into monsters, and the anguish centuries later as he watched them butchered to serve a brother's lunatic ambition. He understood the noble idea that had stayed the Primarch's hand throughout the battle, recognizing it for what it was, not for what he had thought it be. He felt his father's forgiveness for doubting him, and he heard his voice in his head. This doom was always meant for me. not you, said Magnus, and Ahriman knew that every warrior of the Thousand Sons was hearing the same thing. You are my sons, and I have failed you. Ahriman wanted to weep at his Primarch's words, feeling the sorrow of a being who had beheld all of creation but fallen short in his reach to grasp it. When Magnus spoke again, he alone heard the Primarch's voice. Azek, lead my sons within the pyramid. No, he cried, tears of grief mingling with the rains falling within the endless night. You must, insisted Magnus, his right arm pointing towards the bronze gates of the pyramid, which now swung open. White light shone enticingly from within. Amon awaits you, and he bears a priceless gift you must bear away from this place. You must do this, or all we have done here will be for naught. What of you, my lord? What will you do? What I must, said Magnus, looking over the raging form of Leman Russ as he charged with a glacial lack of speed into the causeway. The Primarch reached down and touched the jade scarab at the center of Ahriman's breastplate. The crystal stone shone with a pale light, and Ahriman felt the immense power resting within. This was cut from the reflecting caves, Magnus said. Every warrior in my legion bears one set within his armor. When the moment comes, and you will know it, concentrate all your energies into this crystal and those of your brothers. I do not understand, pleaded Ahriman. What must I do? What you have been destined to do ever since before you were born, said Magnus. Now go. I will stand with you, vowed Ahriman. No, said Magnus, with an air of infinite regret. You will not. Our fates are unraveling as we speak, even now. And what happens here has to happen. Do this last thing for me, Azek. Though it broke his heart, Ahriman nodded, and the world swelled around him as the flow of time restored its integrity from the distortion Magnus's arrival had created. The bellows of burning pyres and the immaterial thunder rolled across the face of the world once more, and the deafening fire of weapons roared ever louder than before. However, now the howl of the Wolf King bolted out about them. Ahriman and the Thousand Sons turned and ran towards the pyramid, and so there would be a fight between the Primarch of the Space Wolves, Leman Russ, and the Primarch of the Thousand Sons, Magnus the Red. And it would be exclusively between the two, as it had been a long time coming. Personal grudges and vendettas simmering to a boil under the puppeteering of Horus Heresy and the Changer of Ways, Tzeentch. Uncountable masses of people filled the pyramid, terrified civilians and exhausted spire guard. The Thousand Sons poured inside, their armor black and dripping from the nightmarish deluge drowning the world beyond. At a conservative estimate, Ahriman guessed that there were just over 1,000 warriors that had escaped the attack of the Wulfen. 1/10 of the legion, he said. A horrifying scale of loss, and it was staggering to him. Hathor Mat and Sobek came alongside him as he struggled to come to terms with what had become of his beloved legion. Still numb from the sight of so few survivors, Ahriman sought out Amon, who stood at the center of the vast chamber. Amon, clad in his armor, but the plates themselves were clean and unblemished. His weapons were sheathed as he carried a reinforced chest, sealed with a padlock of cold iron. He said, "You would live," said Amon. "Yes, years ago, as you lay dying, in the midst of the flesh change, he knew you would live to see this day." "Spare me your tales," stormed Ahriman. "The Primarch said you have something for me." "I do," confirmed Amon, holding up a chest for Ahriman to open. "It's locked, to all others perhaps, but not to you." "We do not have time for this," hissed Ahriman, looking over his shoulder as the two gods of war clashed. With the sound of worlds colliding, blazing light filled the pyramid, and the howl of Leman Russ vied with the thunderous lightning of Magnus. "You must make time," snapped Amon, "or this will be for nothing." Ahriman reached to open up and took hold of the lock, which snapped open with a metallic click at the touch of his hand. He opened the lid and drew a breath as he saw the book within, its cover red and cracked with age, as though it had been an archaeological find instead of a working grimoire. "The Book of Magnus," breathed Hathor Mat. "Why me?" demanded Ahriman. "Because you are its new bearer," said Amon. "You are said to keep it safe and ensure the knowledge contained within its pages never falls into the wrong hands." Ahriman lifted the book from the iron chest, feeling the weight of power and expectation contained within its hollowed pages. The potency of incantations and formulae called to him, alluring and redolent with promises of great things he might achieve, with the secrets inscribed upon its pages. He wanted to refuse, to place the book back in its chest and secure the lock so that no one could ever gaze upon its pages and crave the power it could grant. He wanted Magnus to return and retrieve his grimoire, but understood with a sudden clarity that was never going to happen. Magnus had no expectation of surviving his duel with Leman Russ. Ahriman took the book and ran back to the bronze gates of the pyramid, desperation lending his strides greater speed. Brilliant flashes of light and thunderous impacts came from the other side of the gate, as colossal forces beyond mortal comprehension were unleashed. Ahriman reached the mighty portal and saw the battle between the two brothers that was unparalleled in its savagery, power, and folly. Magnus and the Wolf King struggled with the fate of a world balanced on the outcome. Forking tresses of lightning shot upwards from the ground, isolating them from the host of wolves and custodes. Russ rained blow after blow on Magnus, shattering the horned breastplate, and in return, Magnus struck his brother with a searing blast of cold fire that cracked armor and set his braided hair alight. It seemed as though the combatants had swollen to enormous proportions, like the giants they were in the myths of legend. The Wolf King's frostblade struck Magnus, but his golden axe turned to blow aside, as they spun and twisted in an epic battle of death and madness, with the wrath of a blazing storm of sheet lightning and pounding thunder. This battle was one that was fought on every level, physical, mental, and spiritual, with each Primarch bending every ounce of their almost limitless power to the other's destruction. The waters around the pyramid broke upon the shores, black as oil, churning as though an unseen tempest had boiled beneath the surface. Space wolves and custodes plowed through the water, wading through the crashing spray to reach the pyramid in lieu of aiding Leman Russ in his battle. Magnus swept his hands to the side, and the warriors in the water cried out in agony as it transformed into a corrosive acid, burning through ceramite plates and rendering flesh and bone into jelly. A thickening rain fit to drown the world, and the ground underfoot transformed into a sinking quagmire from which writhing shapes like grasping hands would emerge. Wounded warriors were dragged down into the mud, struggling against the unseen attacks, but were unable to resist being pulled under to their doom. Prospero was breaking apart, the veil between worlds was cracking, and the maddening gibbers and screams of the great ocean's denizens drove men to their knees, in fright and terror alike. The assault on the senses was total, and Ahriman could barely keep his feet as hurricane-force winds battered the pyramid, tearing glass panels from its structure and breaking the silver and gold towers from its corners. Thunder banged in the midnight sky, and heaving earthquakes ripped ever-widening cracks in the ground, toppling the few structures of Zika that remained. At the epicenter of this destruction were Magnus the Red and Leman Russ, and Ahriman watched the two titans wrestle with the bitter enmity only reserved for those who had once called each other friend. Such a contest of arms was the most desperate thing Ahriman had ever seen. He wanted to rush forward to remind them of their former kinship, but to intervene in such a planet-shaking conflict would be self-termination. Ahriman had cautioned his warriors not to wield their powers for fear of the flesh change, but Magnus showed no such restraint, and battered Leman Russ with a fist wreathed in fire and lightning. Russ was a Primarch, and such powers as could shatter armies had little effect on him, save to drive him to higher fits of rage. Magnus drove his fist into Russ's chest, the icy breastplate cracking open with a sound like planets colliding, and shards of ceramite stabbed the Wolf King's heart. In return, Russ snapped Magnus' arm back, and Ahriman could hear it shatter like 1,000 pieces of glass. A blade of pure thought unsheathed itself from Magnus's other arm, as he drove it deeper and deeper still into Russ's chest through his shattered armor, and the blade would burst from the back of Russ, and the Wolf King howled, letting loose a deafening bellow of pain. A chorus of wolves that were not wolves added their own howls to that of their master. The two enormous lupine monsters that accompanied Russ leapt upon Magnus, fastening their jaws upon his legs, as Magnus slammed his fist into the back of the black wolf's head, driving it into the ground with a strangled yelp, its skull surely shattered. With a bellow of anger, Magnus tore the white wolf from his leg, and with a thought hurled it away, over his head and Russ's back. Ahriman suddenly felt a hand than many, dragging him back, away from the howling winds and the driving rain that tore through the gates. He tried to shake them off, as if someone shouted his name. Hatormat and Ammon pulled him away from the entrance as the vast mechanisms slowly began to haul the enormous gates closed. "No," he shouted, as his words were snatched away by the screaming winds. "We can't. We must," shouted Hatormat, pointing towards the crashing waters separating the space wolves from the pyramid. Using the stalks of their bolters as paddles, the enemy had jury-rigged concave shards of roof debris as makeshift boats, and were surging over the waves the gateway. The water itself had returned to its natural state, as the froth patches of liquids, flesh, and bone began scumming back to the surface, as the only reminder of the men who had once died there. Hordes of Vulfin plunged into the water, entire packs pushing towards the pyramid, with hundreds more right behind them. Ahriman looked past the approaching monsters to see Magnus the Red and Leman Russ locked in battle high above the causeway. The furious horror of their struggle obscured by the ethereal bursts of fire and lightning. A flare of black light erupted, and Russ cried out in agony. His blade lashed out blindly and struck a fateful blow against his foe's most dreaded weapon, his eye. In an instant, the pyrokinetic cascade of light and fire was extinguished, and a stunning silence swept outwards. All motion ceased, and the titans battling on the causeway were no more. Each Primarch now returned to their customary stature. Ahriman cried out as Magnus reeled back from the Wolf King, his hand reaching his eye. His shattered arm crackled with regenerative energies. As broken and bloodied as Leman Russ was, he was a brawler enough to seize the opportunity, as he barreled into the grip of Magnus the Red and held him around the waist like a wrestler, roaring as he lifted his brother up above his body and high above his head. All eyes turned to Russ as he brought Magnus down across his knee. The sound of the Crimson King's back breaking tore through every warrior of the Thousand Sons' heart. Ahriman fell to his knees, dropping the book of Magnus in sympathetic pain, like a white-hot spear stabbed straight through him. No pain in the world was worse, for this blow could unmake a Primarch, and such wounds were like a death strike 100 times over to any mortal warrior. He knelt against the closing gateway as a Wolfin finally reached the shoreline, alongside warriors led by blood-fanged captains with burned hair and ice-bladed axes. The Wolf King triumphed as he said a loud howl and brought his frost blade down upon the head of his defeated foe. With the last of his strength, Magnus turned his head, and the remnants of his ravaged eye found Ahriman. "This is my last gift to you." Leman Russ' blade swept down as its lethal edge struck, but just at that moment, Magnus whispered unnatural syllables, unknown to man since he first raised his guttural chants to the nameless gods in the sky. Magnus's body underwent an instantaneous dissolution, its entire structure unmade with a word, and Ahriman gasped as the vast depths of power surged into his body. It was too much for any mortal to contain, but it swept through him, and he knew what he had to do. He clasped upon the jade scarab set upon his breastplate, filling his mind with every curve, nuance, and imperfection, the intricacies of its golden mounting, and the exact dimensions of the black scarab worked into its substance. He knew everything about the gem and pictured the identical artifacts in the chests of each and every warrior of the Thousand Sons, and even as he visualized them, the power in him spread to the entire legion as Magnus gave the last of his strength to save his sons. A terrific groaning shattered the stillness, like the spine of a world sundering and shearing out of tune. The sound of madness tore through the mundanity of substance as reality drew its dying breath, as a god unleashed its power. The surface of Prospero twisted and turned as Ahriman felt a dreadful lurch and the sickening feeling of vertigo. It felt like he was falling, as if the world itself had bottomed out, and he descended upon an endless shaft as the world vanished and was replaced by the complete and utter blackness at the end of the universe, when all living things had been dust for billions of years. As it appears, in those last desperate moments when death seemed inevitable, Magnus reached deep into the warp and enacted a desperate spell, and with it he tore open a portal and spirited away what remained of his legion, the survivors, the ruins of Sika, and the last of their sacred knowledge. they all vanished into the imperium, to a world prepared for them by a being that had watched closely, Tzeentch, the changer of ways. And so their new refuge was hidden deep within the Eye of Terror, and would come to be known as the planet of the Sorcerers, and thus ended Prospero, not in battle, not in glory, but in betrayal of a kind most foul, not by decree, but by design. Now removed from the galactic stage, by not just the will of the Imperium, but perhaps by something darker, by the very manipulations of chaos, and the god who sought to be patron therein. It seems that after the fall, the Legion was once again reduced to a fraction of its might, as roughly 1,000 battle-ready psykers and warriors remained with the living. But fate perhaps had different designs, as it reunited them with over 3,000 scattered brethren who had been stationed away prior to the razing of their home. By the time of the Siege of Terra, their strength had swelled to an estimated 9,000 Space Marines. Though they were now a legion in name more than structure, they had become manyfold more powerful than they had been previously. And so, during the Heresy's middling years, the Thousand Sons largely vanished from coordinated action. Fragmented cells of the Legion were confirmed operating independently from the wishes of the Primarch upon distant worlds such as Prism, Cabal, and Logan's world, along with Yaman, and appearing within other warbands. Notably, these groups exhibited divided loyalties. Some pledged their strength to Horus. Others, despite the wounds inflicted upon them by the Emperor's decree, remained loyal to the Imperium. These so-called loyalists often operated alongside similarly estranged forces, such as the Black Shields. Amongst these fragments were several notable factions: the Fifth Fellowship under Sul Kuntep, who escaped Prospero and would later ally himself with the Imperial Fist; sect operating from the Forge World of Zau Akald, along with the warband of Corsion; and, most mysteriously, the Thousand Sons attached to the 209th Expeditionary Fleet, still loyal, were irrevocably altered. Meanwhile, the Legion's central body had turned inwards, focusing on the shattered soul of their Primarch, following Magnus the Red's near death during the razing of Prospero. It was also discovered that his essence had splintered into multiple shards, each one essentially a consciousness unto their own. Ahriman, alongside his cabal of sorcerers, dedicated their efforts to recovering and restoring these fragments. Their successes were near total, yet Magnus revealed that a final shard rested upon Terra. Just as the traitor host set its sights on humanity's throne world, their mission was now set. When the Siege of Terra commenced, Magnus and his Thousand Sons were amongst its very first invaders. Though their numbers remained relatively small, their role was distinct. Rather than wage open war, they acted as a vanguard of arcane warfare, summoning demonic allies and weaving sorcerers' support onto the greater offensive. It wasn't until the outer bulwark of the Imperial Palace was breached that they were called upon once more into direct action, as the Thousand Sons unraveled the psychic wards protecting the Emperor's sanctum. Sorcerers channeled their devastating rituals, while legionaries clashed with the Imperial defenders, and yet their advance was broken by a counterassault led by Rogel Dorn. He himself was accompanied by the remaining librarians of the Blood Angels and the Imperial Fists, directed by the Emperor to blunt the Sorcerers' tides. In a final desperate measure, Magnus would lead a strike team, ostensibly designed to reclaim his final shard. However, upon learning it was unreachable, he turned his mission. Magnus now sought to slay the Emperor outright, his plan foiled by the Salamander's Primarch Vulcan and his elite Drake swords, along with the Space Wolf's infamous Bovir Brojak. During this brutal confrontation, Magnus would surrender fully to the ruinous powers, as he vanished with his surviving followers into the depths of the Imperial dungeon, and he would eventually be met by Vulcan in a direct confrontation. And with their Primarch irreversibly corrupted, the Thousand Sons cast their remaining loyalty behind Horus, joining the final climactic assault upon the Eternity Gate. In the Webway, Magnus enacted a ritual to drain the Emperor of his power and compromise his anti-demonic defenses. Here, Vulcan would once again intervene. In his dreams, his brother still looked like his brother. The landscape around them was a volcanic nightmare, and the realm of blackened skies and boiling earth. This was a very dragon's delight. The two brothers took counsel together. In their psychic silence, the two of them facing one another, in the arena of the unreal reality that his brother was the one to bring them here each and every time. And if it wasn't for his brother's will, then it was the whim of the thing with their talons around his brother's heart. Vulcan no longer believed there was a difference when he saw his reflection in the pool of volcanic glass. He appeared the way he felt, wary to the point of ruination, a fact he could mask easily enough in the throne room. Yet he had no hope of hiding here. In this place, he appeared as a dragon on the edge of decrepitude. His scales no longer shimmered with an emerald luster. Instead, they faded to a flawed jade. His eyes, which had been searing red, were tight and dull with torment. Even the fire within him was down to an ember. A guttering flicker of warmth was all that was left. His brother, the sorcerer, descended slowly in a haze of pure light. The light warmed the dragon. It quickened his blood and reknit the throbbing internal breaches inside his body. It promised true healing if he would only stop resisting. "I hate seeing you like this," his brother said. Compassion shone in the sorcerer's eyes. "It needn't be this way. You are not my brother," the dragon grunted as he shifted his pained form. Even his bones ached. They sent pulses of cold through the meat of his muscles. "You still deny me?" the sorcerer said, his words rich with regret. "Do I not bring you here to Nocturne to ease your spirit?" The dragon managed to laugh, though it tasted of dust instead of fire. "This is not Nocturne," he said. "The stars hang where they should in the sky, yet they shine wrong in the black. The chemical processes of the rock are exact, yet the stone feels wrong to the touch. This is Nocturne through the eyes of someone who has seen my homeworld but never understood it. Someone that never loved it." The dragon, despite his throbbing joints, bared his fragile fangs in a tired smile. "Someone," he added, "or something." The sorcerer went down to one knee, the very image of unearthing reverence. His voice, trembling with emotion, scarcely rose above a whisper. "I am still me, brother. I speak only the truth." The dragon sighed with another ashy breath. "The truth, if it even matters in dreams, is that my brother died long ago. You are not Magnus. You are an impostor. You are an impossible god's idea of Magnus." The laughter echoed around them, the laughter of 1,000 mocking voices, delighted in a joke only one of the brothers could truly understand. The dragon clawed back from a chorus of mad mirth, while the sorcerer stood in silence, radiating compassion, radiating patience and understanding. "How can you not hear that laughter?" the dragon asked him. "You are mocked without end, by a god you pretend you do not pray to." The dragon gave a wary smile. "There is no laughter," said Magnus. "I hear nothing but your lies, Vulcan." The dragon smiled, a mouthful of cracked fangs. Enough of you. Enough of that thing animating you. Leave me be." "Let me in," countered the sorcerer. "This is only the beginning of your pain, brother. I have foreseen a greater agony in your future, agony that you cannot endure. But that pain will end with the mercy I bring. In place of devastation, I offer you enlightenment." The dragon dared not turn his back on his one-eyed brother, even here in dreams. He withdrew slowly, crawling over the rocks, his slitted gaze never leaving the sorcerer. "Let me in," said Magnus again. "How much strength does father have left? How much time remains in his performative defiance? An hour, a day, the skies above turn to ash. Clouds seethe with the anger of gods. The Khan is finished. Guilliman is still lost within the endless black. Angron bathes the Palatine ring in Imperial blood, and soon he will break Sanguinius. Fate sings of all this, Vulcan. I will reach the webway portal, and I will break father's barrier. In a million futures I already have. Don't make me break you with it." The dragon gave a growl. "I am not sure I can be broken. You can die, Vulcan. You can be unmade. Everything of mortal origin can be unwoven with the lullaby of obliteration. Please don't make me be the one to end you." "Does your fate sing of that too?" Magnus smiled. "It grieves me to admit it, brother, but yes. To oppose me is to suffer annihilation. I wish it were not true, and it need not be so." The dragon managed to return the smile. He was too wary to be amused, but the sorcerer's insistences still kindled something like mirth deep within. "Of the many failures of our family," the dragon said with clenched teeth, "you stand exalted above the rest of us, warped so comfortably in your delusions. At least the others have the courage to face up to what they have become. Only you, Magnus, only you still cannot see who you really are." The dragon breathed the words, feeling like a fire had awoken inside, tasting the smoke running between the sore teeth. There you are, brother. And their fight would go on. Magnus becoming more and more frustrated with Vulcan's inability to remain dead as, with each blast of eldritch power, Vulcan's very form would reknit itself, driving the Crimson King mad. And in his frustration, he was met with the reality that Vulcan had been empowered by their father. His regenerative abilities driven to new heights, those which it seemed Magnus's powers could not breach. Magnus continued blasting him until the point that the exertion of power had driven him down to one knee, his wings broken, his face in essence a cracked portrait of something he never was. No more Vulcan. He dribbled the words through the crushed jaw. No more. Vulcan circled around the drowned creature. His eyes narrowed, even for the merest moment. The demonic blood on his hammer steamed with the smell of a putrid funeral pyre. He didn't trust his brother's vulnerability, and he saw his caution reflected in him through Magnus's blood-webbed eye. I sense the energies that weave through you, said Vulcan, thinner, weaker, but still cursing and curling around us in the air. You are still seeking to attack Father. He expected Magnus to laugh. Instead, the sorcerer sighed. You deal with forces you do not comprehend. Killing me may let the Emperor breathe easier, but it will not free him from the Golden Throne. Vulcan's tone was now laced with ice and iron. Nevertheless, you will die. So finish it. Magnus hunched over, lowering his head for an executioner's blow. Save the Emperor. Let ignorance triumph over truth. Can you afford to wait any longer, little dragon? Magnus slowly raised his head as he gazed at Vulcan with mockery. Where is your urgency now? Where is all that righteousness? Knowing it was a trap, knowing he had little choice but to spring it, Vulcan raised his hammer. As it fell, the world turned. It wasn't blackness this time. He saw planets turning in the depths of night. Beautiful no matter what their color or surface conditions. Beautiful for their infinite complexity. Vulcan never looked at a planet and saw territories, cities, or resources. He saw a geological jewel, a sphere formed by astrophysical law and geomathematical processes binding it all together. He saw each world as unique, shaped just so. He believed that there was beauty in that. He drifted through space, descending to one world until it was a plateau beneath him. Hazy atmosphere. I thought we could speak. No, brother. Magnus showed his pale red palms, bare of any weapon. No, time is passing. In the labyrinth of the old ones, our hands are around each other's throats, with death yet decided. Here, we exist between heartbeats. Vulcan stared into his brother's lone eye. I believe you, he said. Magnus gave a wary smile. It's been a long time since I've heard those words. Prospero turned beneath them. Vulcan gazed at the wilds of the vast pagan continent, Pangean continent, and the distant silver pinprick of Zika, the world's only city. Speak then, and you will listen? Vulcan nodded. Very well. This is what you would have understood, brother. The Imperium is a lie we tell ourselves to make sense of a reality we fear to face. Under the Emperor, we have perpetuated a war that has sucked worlds dry of resources and cost billions upon billions of lives. We have spent life like meaningless currency, all because one man said we must. How many cultures have been annihilated, Vulcan? How many have we assimilated and robbed of their vitality, replacing innovation with conformity? How much knowledge have we destroyed because our father decided no one was allowed to learn it? Vulcan considered this as the planets rolled in a slow and sedated pace. This is how it got you, isn't it? Vulcan answered. Vulcan knew the answer even as he asked the question. The creature that gouged its way into your soul and laid eggs there. The thing that pulls your strings. Did it promise you knowledge? Did it paint the Emperor as the death of enlightenment? Magnus's expression answered for him. Long red hair fell to frame his face, and the sorcerer brushed it back from his cheeks. The imperial truth was a lie. The empire we built cannot be reformed, only overthrown. From violence it was born, and in violence it must end. Do you not see it? Once the board is swept clean, we can start again, with our eyes open and aware of the truths of the universe. You make it sound like a principled stand, said Vulcan, as if all you have done, all Horus has done, could ever be justified. Magnus turned to him sharply. What do I have to justify? Each time I was attacked, I defended myself. Each time they tried to silence me, I made sure to speak out. The Imperium lavished punishments upon my legion, draping its hypocrisy over us like a funeral shroud. And we fought back. Vulcan met Magnus's gaze, seeing the iron-clad surety there. This was futile. He knew it, yet the words came forth anyway. Look at the horrors your side has unleashed upon Terra. The massacres, the mutations. Magnus, you are taking part in the execution of your species. You cannot truly think you have done nothing wrong. Even you, brother, even you in your arrogance cannot believe this is justified. Necessity justifies all. This is necessary. Without this primeval force, without chaos, there would be stagnation, ignorance instead of illumination, existence instead of life. I did not write the laws of the universe, brother. I only take joy in the truth of this reality, but I won't hide from it. Vulcan would question, necessary to whom? An alien god exalted you and now demands you commit genocide? Magnus clenched his teeth, and the world once more turned. But not too far to reveal Zika, the city of light, the metropolis with white pyramids, and the city was aflame, beneath them burning in hellfire. Golden vessels of the Emperor's chosen, sleek black hunting ships of the Sisters of Silence, and the vessels themselves of the Space Wolves. They were many, and Prospero had so few. The raising of Prospero. There was murder in Magnus's eyes, murder and sorrow. Bear witness to our brother Russ bringing death upon my homeworld, and to all its people. Tell me, Vulcan, would you have reacted with temperance had it been the destruction of Nocturne instead? Vulcan didn't need to stare at the orbital bombardment, as he had read the reports. He'd seen pictures and footage and spoken to many of the custodians that took part in the assault. Nothing unfolding here was a revelation he wished to experience twice. Russ was lied to by Horus, deceived into attacking. I know, it changes nothing, but it should. You who value truth so highly would align yourself with the one who engineered the death of Prospero. And when the Space Wolves fleet arrived in your sky, what did you do, Magnus? Did you try to enlighten Russ? Did you use your power to prevent the assault? Or did the belief in your own persecution leave you assuming the worst of the Emperor's intentions? All witnesses say you languished in your tower, welcoming the destruction as your penance, until you decided to fight in the final hours, when it was too late to stop the massacre. Vulcan gestured to the destruction under the reigning atmosphere. Why would the Emperor order you and your entire legion dead? Did you not stop to wonder at the scale of this misunderstanding? I did, said Magnus. I thought he wished to punish me for ruining his great work. For a moment, Magnus paused, gazing at the host of Neverborn darkening the tunnels, as if seeing them for the first time. But how was I supposed to know? He refused to tell me of his great plan. If he had told me, Vulcan resisted the urge to spit at the sudden foul taste in his tongue. Again, you see the worst in all others, absolving yourself of blame. Why do you need to know of the great work? You were warned not to toy with the warp. We all were, but you couldn't resist. You believed you knew more, that you knew best, and that is why you alone lament being kept unappraised of Father's plans. Why is Sanguinius not enraged that he never knew of the Webway project? Why am I not enraged that I was kept ignorant of it? Why did you need to know? Magnus's eye gleamed with the reflection of a burning icon ahead. His former self, years before, racing to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal, reducing the Webway into an unsanctified scrap of rubble. With his very passing, Vulcan laughed with an unbearable tenor. How could Father have predicted you would defy his command? Not only did he use the will of the warp against his orders, you fueled your psychic warning with human sacrifice. How could he have known any of us capable of such barbarity? Magnus exhaled slowly, his hands clutching at the folds of his toga. He spoke a word of power, and the world turned. I had to warn him, said Magnus. No, Vulcan said. You believed that you had to warn him. You believed, as you always have, that you knew best, that you had to act, that you alone knew what had to be done. And never once did you think, through all of this destruction, that someone was deceiving you. The sorcerer glared at him. Why do you speak as if I were some lowly pawn in this game of regicide? The War Master, the Emperor, both know I am the most valuable piece upon the board. Vulcan was unmoved by the sorcerer's words, and by the cataclysm playing around before them. His tone was patient as it had ever been before the war. Vanity is what leads you, Magnus. You choke on arrogance, unable to see the architect of your own downfall. All of the others, all of Horus's broken monsters, at least they can see the bars of their cages. Even Horus, driven out of his mind to serve as a hive for the Pantheon, knows in his soul's core that he has lost control. You are the only one who believes he is still free. In the silence, Magnus would shake his head. as the world turned within motion. They remained in the throne room, but the great machines were overlaid in black and slain by esoteric forces, and the industry of the laboratory was replaced by a militaristic garrison presence. It was no longer a place of vision, it was a barracks, and it was closer to now. This was how the throne room had looked when Vulcan had last been there. Vulcan and Magnus were presented alongside their drifting past, as though in their recent incarnations. They watched themselves at the foot of the golden throne. Vulcan, implacable but for the regret lingering in his features. Magnus manifested as a beam of light, shimmering in and out of the layers of reality, barely perceivable to the human eye. Here, said Magnus, here is where I made my choice. You saw the Emperor make his final offer to me. You heard him promise me a new legion if I would only forsake Horus and come back to you all. A matter of mere weeks ago, brother. Will you tell me you have forgotten it? Vulcan sighed. He seemed suddenly weary. That is not how it transpired here, Magnus. The last unstained shard of your soul burst into the throne room and begged us to be saved. With a heavy heart, Father refused you. That is what I saw. That is what happened. Magnus's laughter was blunt and particularly derisive. And you say I'm the one who's been deceived. Vulcan was too tired to raise his bait. He merely met derision with solemnity. This thing runs through you. This chaotic force that you proclaim to be freedom. This is not but a disease to be caught on contact. It is a layer of emotion beneath reality, a poison that has achieved near sentience. You cannot pray it away. Once the rot sets in, once you're on the path, your fate is sealed. Wait, Vulcan, wait, how can this be? How do you know all of this? In the silence that reigned in the wake of their words, the throne room began to fade. Golden mist hazed its way around them, revealing patches of wraithbone architecture. Vulcan was relentless, his voice growing firmer. How could the Emperor ever trust you now? Why would he offer you a new legion, let alone a place at his side? You dreamed up your own redemption, just to give yourself something to rage against, because you need to feel as though you are the one choosing, not having choices made for you. The creature that has exalted you will never let you see the chains that bind you. The mist was everywhere, thickening as Magnus felt the change upon him, and beneath the sensation of power was a pull, a wrenching, a sensation of a trillion filaments woven into every last cell of his body, dragging at him. How, Magnus could barely ask, his voice shy of a breath. Where the mist touched him, his flesh was darkening, swelling. The shadow of raged wings loomed above him. How do you know this? Vulcan remained in place, saying nothing, doing nothing. Who are you? The world turned, and this time it wasn't moved by Magnus's will. The first strike of the hammer pounded Magnus into the wraithbone, a magma flow of ectoplasm running from his riven skull. The second cracked bones of one of his wings, splintering the spine of his shoulder blade. The third eradicated the demon's right hand, rendering it into dissolving paste. Breathless, standing over the paralyzed remnants of his mutated brother, Vulcan raised his hammer. In that same moment, Magnus somehow lifted his head as the sorcerer stared past Vulcan, over his executioner's soldier. Either he saw nothing, or he saw without the use of his eye, which had burst like fruit, turning into leaking pulp from his shattered socket. Wait, the demon winced, wheezing, as the word was ruined by a graveyard of teeth. Father, wait. Father is far from here, Vulcan almost said, wondering what visions were conjured in his brother's dying mind. But he saw fear in Magnus's face, imprinted with lines of regret. It was enough to make him hesitate. I do not have to do this, but he did. Not because it would free the Emperor of the Sorcerer's assault, not because of the thousands dying in front of the Eternity Gate, but because it was how the arch-enemy drilled inside a heart and soul. The creatures sank their tendrils into a person's hesitations, cracking them open to become doubts, creased along the edges of someone's virtues, heightening them and then souring them into flaws. They would do the same to Vulcan's mercy. Mercy was how the Pantheon would welcome him, and how he would begin to do their will. He would trust someone that breathed deceit. He would spare the life of a man that must die, and he would feel righteous as his 9 traitorous brothers felt righteous, deaf to the laughter of the gods as he moved in their etheric melodies. Like his brothers, he would believe that it was his own virtue guiding his hand. And so Vulcan swung one last time. With their master broken, the resolve of the Thousand Suns absolutely collapsed, and their lines fell apart. In the aftermath of Horus's death, the Thousand Sons fled Terra with the remnants of the traitor legions, utilizing their masteries of sorcery in order to open a conduit into the warp and spirit them away, hiding amongst those within the planet of the Sorcerers, marking their end in the role of the Heresy and the beginning of a far darker legacy. In the aftermath of the destruction of Prospero, the Thousand Sons' vendetta against the Space Wolves began to become one of their most bitter and ongoing conflicts. Driven by their hatred for those who had brought them to their fall, the Thousand Sons launched numerous campaigns of retribution against the Space Wolves as they sought to undermine and destroy their ancient enemies, even as they too became pawns in the hands of the craven dark gods. One such attempt would involve the creation of a Chaos Temple atop a mountain spire upon the Space Wolves' homeworld of Fenris. This temple was dedicated to Tzeentch, and it would be known as the Demon Spire. Its creation was masterminded by Madoc, a high-ranking Chaos Space Marine in direct service to Magnus, and it was intended to serve as a base of operations for the Thousand Sons and their continuous conflicts against the Space Wolves. The Thousand Sons' efforts to destroy the Space Wolves did not end there, as upon the world of Graham, they would attempt to steal the Spear of Rust, a sacred artifact of the Space Wolves, in order to perform dark sorcerous rituals. Their goal was to transform the entire planet into a new demon world, bound completely to the will of chaos. However, their plan failed, though the spear was lost in the ensuing battle. The Imperial Guard were able to retake Graham and expunge the forces of chaos from the planet. In a pivotal moment, Ragnar Blackmane, the legendary hero of the Space Wolf, defeated Maddox, and in a desperate act, he cast the Spear of Rust into the partly manifested form of Magnus, banishing him back into the warp once again. The spear, however, would be permanently lost to the depths of the Imperium, but the threat of chaos would be temporarily repelled. The war between the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves would continue for millennia to come, driven by an undying hatred forged in the fires of betrayal and bloodshed. Their conflict would become one of the central threads in the stories of not only the Horus Heresy, but in the history of the Imperium as a whole, a testament to a tragic fall of a once proud legion, and the unyielding vengeance of a fractured brotherhood. After the fire and fury of the Horus Heresy, the blood feud between the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves continued to burn brightly, fueled by a legacy of betrayal and violence. But vengeance, it seems, is a motivation that does not easily fade. Despite the passage of countless centuries since the fall of Prospero, the bitter enmity between the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves did not wane. In the 32nd millennium, Magnus the Red, now a demon Primarch, orchestrated a campaign of vengeance against the Space Wolves, seeking to avenge the destruction of his legion and the loss of his homeworld. This was not revenge of the immediate kind, but rather a protracted campaign, driven by a fury that had burned since the brutal assault on Prospero. By this time, most of the Space Wolves who had fought during the original siege of Prospero had long since passed to the mists of time. Yet the Space Wolves' legacy, driven by a cycle of vengeance and loyalty, had not faded. It was the Great Wolf of Fenris, Harkon Ironhelm, who would find himself at the center of this renewed conflict. Magnus, through the sorceries of Tzeentch, began a series of raids against worlds on the periphery of Fenris, attempting to lure the Great Wolf into open combat. The Thousand Sons sought not only to weaken the Space Wolves, but to inflame the animosity between the two legions to greater heights. Magnus, ever the manipulator, even began to invade the dreams of Harek Ironhelm, taunting him with images of conquered worlds. In these dreams, Magnus would walk amongst the smoke of the ruined cities as a constant reminder of what he had lost and what he intended to take back from the Space Wolves. His message was clear: the Thousand Sons were coming, and Harek Ironhelm would have no escape from this ghost of the past. Eventually, Ironhelm followed what he believed to be the Thousand Sons to their hidden base on Ganvaya, an isolated world within the galactic fringe. In his determination to bring down the Thousand Sons in glorious battle and to end their raids once and for all, Ironhelm launched a full-scale assault upon the base. This move, while bold, played directly into the hands of Magnus the Red. The assault on Gamba allowed the Thousand Sons to draw Ironhelm away from the safety of Fenris, leaving the homeworld of the Space Wolves vulnerable for attack. Taking advantage of this opening, the Thousand Sons launched a devastating assault upon Fenris directly. For 40 days and nights, the Thousand Sons besieged the legendary Fang Citadel, the heart of the Space Wolves chapter. The Citadel, long thought impregnable, now found itself utterly under siege by Sorcerers forces and demonic entities. The defenders, led by Bjorn the Fell-Handed, now a venerable dreadnought, were forced to retreat into the depths of the Fang in order to regroup. With Bjorn leading the last stand, the Space Wolves sent out a desperate call in the form of a series of scouts to inform Ironhelm of the siege, calling for reinforcements from the Space Wolves fleet. When Ironhelm received the call, he returned with the fury of a wolf chasing its prey. The great wolf, driven by the insatiable desire to bring Magnus to justice, arrived on Fenris with his forces prepared for battle. However, when he faced Magnus, he confronted an adversary beyond his expectations. Magnus, wielding a terrible power, boosted further still by his ascension to demonhood, was far stronger than a mere mortal Primarch should be. As the two leaders met in combat on the slopes of the Fang, this was a place sacred to the Space Wolves, the battle that followed was nothing short of legendary. Ironhelm fought with the fury of the Space Wolves' heritage, but Magnus, empowered by his demonic patronage, proved too powerful for a mere Space Marine to contend with. By the end, Herrick would be slain, his body left broken on the frozen ground of Fenris, but not before inflicting a terrible wound on Magnus. A final reminder of the deep, eternal enmity between the two legions. When the Space Wolves chapter fleet finally arrived in full force to confront the Thousand Sons had fulfilled their objective, so they retreated into the warp, leaving Fenris in a temporary state of disarray and an uneasy peace, with the threat of another assault just hanging above them, like a sword of Damocles. Yet the death of Harkin Ironhelm, the Great Wolf of Fenris, was a victory for Magnus that the Space Wolves would not be able to bravado their way out of, one that would weigh heavily upon the Legion, since it, unlike many of the other chapters who were divided due to the Codex Astartes, had remained in a Legion formation. The events of this battle would only serve to deepen the animosity between the two legions further still, to the point that the Space Wolves might even prioritize hunting down Thousand Sons legionaries over other objectives. This, in essence, ensured that the conflict between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons would remain at the forefront of both legions' interactions and priorities for millennia to come. Something that is extremely important within the history of the Thousand Sons is what would occur in the grim aftermath of the Burning of Prospero and the Horus Heresy's wake, as the Thousand Sons were scattered, hunted, and altered beyond reason, leading to the Legion finding themselves ravaged by the very force they had once sought to master, the warp. Chief amongst their torments was the unceasing return of a very familiar curse, one they had fled from even in their golden days during the Great Crusade, the flesh change. It was an affliction of grotesque mutation and loss of identity, a legacy of their unstable genomes, twisted further by prolonged exposure to the Eye of Terror, and the malevolent will of Tzeentch, the Chaos God of Change, whose gifts often came with a terrible cost. Even after their sanctuary on the planet of the Sorcerers was established, mutation continued to surge unchecked. The Marines of the Thousand Sons, once scholars, warriors, and seers, found themselves degenerating into madness, uncontrollable chaos spawns, along with being stripped of their dignity, reason, and identity. Their medical knowledge proved absolutely futile, as mutation was not a disease to be cured. Rather, it was a fate imposed upon them by a greater power. At the center of this crisis stood Isaac Ahriman, once the chief librarian of the Legion and Magnus the Red's most trusted advisor. Ahriman had witnessed the flesh change long before Prospero had fallen, and he had watched as his own twin brother, Osmund, was reduced to a gibbering monstrosity by that very same illness, an experience which had scarred Ahriman deeper than any wound he had ever received. From that moment forward, he had sworn to save his brothers from a fate he saw as worse than death. This became an obsession, and later his very undoing. In their exile, as mutation surged once more, Ahriman presented a solution, a grand spell, and a final gambit to preserve what little of the Legion remained intact. This spell would become known as the Rubric of Ahriman. Despite fierce debate amongst the sorcerer librarian, it was only after Magnus the Red's ascension to demonhood that a fragile consensus was reached. A cabal would come to be formed, comprised of the Legion's greatest psykers, and the rubric would be cast into reality. What followed could only be described as a cataclysm of uncountable proportions through a psychic event. Warp-charged lightning crackled across the surface of the planet of the Sorcerers, each bolt striking with targeted unnatural precision as every 1,000 suns, regardless of their station and ability, was struck. Those without significant psychic potential were reduced to naught but ash in an instant, their physical forms obliterated rather than altered within their armor. Yet their spirit remained trapped and bound within their warplate, completely subservient to their masters. These warriors became known as the Rubricae, silent, soulless automata, as their essence was confined to eternal duty. For those with psychic gifts, the effects were just as transformative, if not more so. Their powers were not merely preserved, but amplified and twisted into new forms. These sorcerers, now more potent than ever, became the ruling elite of a legion made hollow, commanding an army of unthinking, spectral warriors bound into metallic husks, shells of what were once men. When Magnus discovered what Ahriman had wrought, he was overcome with fury. The Rubricae had stabilized the mutation, but at an unbearable cost. His sons, his legion, had largely been turned into little more than puppets, encased in living tombs. Magnus moved to strike Ahriman down, but in a moment heavy with fate, Tzeentch directly intervened. The Chaos God's will stayed the Primarch's hand, tightening the collar around his neck. Whether it was amusement, strategy, or punishment that guided the changer of ways, none could say, but in that moment Magnus had been shown the bars of his very cage. Instead of death, Ahriman was cast out, an exile, cursed to wander the galaxy, with the burden of what he had done hanging forever over his head, till kingdom come and trumpet sound. His act may have saved the Legion from a physical collapse, but it destroyed them spiritually. What had begun as a desperate hope became the defining tragedy of the 1,000 Suns. Not long after this grim transformation, the first battle of Gram unfolded. Gram was a shrine world sacred to the Space Wolves, as it bore the tomb of a wolf lord who had once sacrificed himself to defend Lehman Russ during the early clashes with Magnus. Entombed above was the Great Spear of Russ, a legendary relic once gifted to the Primarch by the Emperor himself, a weapon that had wounded Magnus the Red during their first fateful duel. The 1,000 Suns, now reshaped into the Rubricae, descended upon the world in force, seeking perhaps revenge, perhaps the spear, or perhaps the desecration of a legacy that marred their own grief. Yet the Space Wolves, blood-bound to protect this sacred ground, repelled the attack, and the spear would remain where it lay. And so Gram endured, scarred but unbroken. In the wake of many victories by the Space Wolves, hard-won defense of the Fang, and the trail of destruction left by Ahriman, the former chief librarian of the 1,000 Suns, the 1,000 Suns turned towards Apollonia. There, nestled amidst the mountain ranges, scorched by ancient wars, stood the Anatheum of Kalikamus, a fortress library containing one of the last complete records of the 1,000 Suns Legion during the era of the Great Crusade. These volumes, penned by Remembrancer Mahavustu Kalamikas, were fiercely guarded and considered top priority and to be cloistered safely by an order of warrior priests who had sworn to preserve the truth of the past against all corruption, be that from within or from without. But their vows could not withstand the fully fledged siege that followed. For one solar month, the skies above Apollonia burned. Warp-tainted fires rained down from the heavens. Arcane engines battered the stonework, and demons clawed at the gates of reason. In time, the defenders would fall, one by one, broken upon the relentless tide of the arch-sorcerer's warhost. Ahriman himself walked through the shattered gate, as he had not come merely for vengeance, he had come for the written soul of his legion. From the vaults below Athenium, he took the records, every scroll, every relic of memory, each and every scrap that could be remembered or even vaguely tied to the Thousand Suns, and left the library as little more than ash. Whether it was out of spite, necessity, or the fear of what others might glean from these records, that is unknown. But what is known is that he directly ordered the complete immolation of the archives. The truth was his, and his alone to wield. Elsewhere, during that same era, the sorcerer Hostep, Magister of the Mind-Eater Thrall Band, received what he claimed to be a vision from the Changer of Ways. Within his revelation, he foresaw his own ascension, not through blood or ritual alone, but by consuming the accumulated thoughts and memories of an entire planetary population. To achieve this destiny, the Mind-Eaters began their dark labor, a vast undertaking of 999 rites, each step towards Hotep's promised moment of apotheosis. And to this day, these rites have not fully ceased. The next era of import is circa 112 M33. This would be when the next sighting of the Thousand Suns proper and or their influence would come, but this time not from sorcery or subterfuge, but in one of the most unexpected places, the feral world of Agoros. What began as a routine mining deployment by the Adeptus Mechanicus devolved into a humiliating conflict. The planet's natives, initially dismissed as Stone Age primitives, revealed themselves as something far more dangerous, particularly when they called upon their flame-tongued shamans. The Adeptus Mechanicus were forced into a perilous situation as they were gutted from within. Their warriors burned alive by forces that defied all explanation, with power that seemed to mirror that of a space marine sorcerer. In desperation, the tech priests invoked an old oath, calling upon the third company of the Relictors. The Astartes advanced through the storm of sorcery, enduring cascades of physical and ephemeral flame, in order to reach the heart of the primitive settlements. There they found dust-caked statues of the Thousand Suns, lining the avenues of a burned city, each facing an obsidian pyramid, atop of which loomed a colossal effigy of Ahriman. The moment this idol was brought down, the statues stirred around it. The dust fell away to reveal Rubricae warriors of the Thousand Suns, long turned to living dust and armor, and they had been disguised, but through these actions they were freed to act upon their orders, following them with an unnatural preciseness, as they would open fire with unrelenting veracity. The battle would last hours, and not a single relictor or tech priest would survive, leading to the city never being reclaimed. It would seem that centuries later, in 579 M37, the Kindled Spirits, a thrall band of exalted sorcerers, initiated a catastrophic ritual in a secluded corridor of the webway. Their objective was to force an incursion into Komarag, the abyssal capital of the Drukhari. What they did not expect was the speed of their reprisal, as hundreds of Drukhari warriors, escorted by Harlequin troops, descended upon the sorcerers from hidden portals. Catching the Kindled Spirits mid-incantation, chaos would meet cruelty in a clash of philosophers and nightmares. With their casting disrupted, the Kindled Spirits counterattacked, as unrelenting gouts of warp flame were unleashed. The violence would tear open the pocket of reality itself, as the structural walls of this area of the webway buckled and ruptured. In that moment, both factions vanished into a warped, broken subrealm within a subrealm. There are whispers carried by those who have brushed too close to this breach, which state combat still rages in that lost dimension, forever entwined in a loop of existence that doesn't exist, in a reality that's always and never, everywhere and nowhere, that death comes only briefly, and that rebirth occurs as a curse, that each warrior, human and Xenos alike, is locked in a perpetual, unending conflict, dying and rising again without end, without cessation, and they will do so until the end of time. At an unknown date on M41, on the far eastern fringe where dust-choked voids and silence had ruled for longer than most empires had stood, lay Etarium III, an airless, barren world whose very existence was forgotten by most Imperial records. Yet despite its isolation, life endured, as a small sect of ascetic human Imperial hermits had made their home there, sequestered in a massive monastic complex carved directly into the mountain range, known as the Reclusium of Etenium. However, that silence would be shattered, as without warning the Thousand Suns dropships pierced the sky, falling like knives, marking the arrival of Madont Hex, sorcerer of the Sixth Curse, and they were dispatched by none other than Ahriman himself. It must be noted that Hex himself did not come for conquest or slaughter, as he had a direct objective, hidden beneath the stone and secrecy. Their approach was deliberate. Through the grey canyons of the Dead World, the Sixth Curse advanced in eerie silence until they reached the sealed adamantine gate of the Reclusium. There, Hex struck at the massive doors 9 times, and they opened, not in surrender, but as if responding to some ancient rite in that very moment. As in that instant, the void itself claimed many of the inhabitants, sucking them out into the violent vacuum outside. The rest, who were sealed within the inner sanctum, were systematically executed, as there would be no resistance. These monks met death with serenity, and in their stillness they offered no opposition, only acceptance. Once the monastery was silent again, Hex descended deeper, beyond the Imperial strata, into the forgotten catacombs, untouched since the Age of Strife. There, beneath millennia of debris and disguise, he found what Ahriman sought, an entrance into the webway. What purpose this would serve the architect of the Rubric of Ahriman remains unknown, but the discovery marked another step in Ahriman's relentless rewriting of fate. During some time in M41, far closer to the heart of the Imperium, in the western segment of Segmentum Solar, the Imperial 5th Strike Force, Anvil of Dorn, boarded a space hulk, a mass of fused wreckage drifting through real space like a derelict beast. Within its mutated hulls, they encountered Mantant, an exalted sorcerer of the Cult of Time. What followed was no ordinary engagement, as the fists pressed forward. The very structure of the space hulk shifted and reformed, its corridors warping in real time, time looping, fracturing outside of regular perception. After a war of attrition unlike any other, Captain Dantarian succeeded in felling Mantant in single combat. However, much like many things involving the Thousand Suns, such victory was merely a lie. As with Mantant's death came a crack of aetheric power, and suddenly the Strike Force themselves found themselves back aboard the cruiser, seemingly untouched and prepared to board the space hulk again, as if it were the very first time. No logs of this recorded anomaly. No logs recorded the anomaly itself. No data slates explained the mounting injuries and drained ammunition. But the survivors remembered fragments, ghosts of pain, a cold dread without source. And then it happened again and again. 8 times the Anvil of Dorn boarded the Hulk. 8 times they fought Manata. 8 times they died. Each time the sorcerer fell, the loop reset itself, his laughter growing louder and louder, ever more mocking, more knowing. By the 9th iteration, only Captain Darnatan remained, alone, exhausted, but with that quintessential Dornian resoluteness, as he boarded the Space Hulk one final time. Unfortunately, he never returned. Whether his final death broke the cycle or merely ensured it would continue in solitude remains unverified. Circa 900 M41, the shrine world of Graham, already soaked in martyrdom from 1,000 conflicts, faced yet another defilement when the Thousand Suns descended once more upon this sacred soil. At the heart of this incursion was Maddox, a chaos sorcerer whose ambitions were cloaked in both heresy and blood. A planetary-scale uprising orchestrated by chaos cultists seated within Graham's underhives masked Maddox's true objective, the Spear of Rust, a relic of immense symbolic and psychic value to the Space Wolves. As rebellion engulfed the main cities of the planet, the Space Wolves deployed a force led by the legendary Ragnar Blackmane, who sought to preserve not only the Imperium's control of the world, but the honor of his chapter. The confrontation between Ragnar and Medak reached its apex just as Magnus the Red, demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns, began to breach into real space. In a final act of desperation, Ragnar hurled the Spear of Russ into the swirling warp rift in order to seal the breach, and banish Magnus before he could fully manifest. And it seems the gamble worked. The incursion would then collapse, and the world, perhaps the galaxy itself, was spared from the most powerful follower of the Changer of Ways. Yet even in victory, there was loss. Many, including Lord Grimnar, the Great Wolf himself, praised Ragnar's sacrificial move, but amongst those within the Fang's halls, whispers remained. Had he saved the chapter, or had he just cast away one of the holiest relics in the Imperium out of unmitigated fear? In the age of unveiling, even triumph leaves a bitter taste in the mouths of the Space Wolves. At an unknown date in M41, within the era already scarred by relentless war and shattered faith, the hidden world of Arcadia stood apart as a sanctuary known only to a few amongst the Eldari, home to the mysterious Harlequins and their legends and their legendary Arcadian Librarium, who within its vaults held one of the most comprehensive repositories of pre-imperial knowledge in existence, catalogues of time, prophecy, and forbidden truths, scribed in runes only madness can decipher. It was here that Ahriman, the exiled chaos sorcerer of the Thousand Suns, led his warband, the Prodigal Sons, on a direct incursion into the heart of Eldari secrecy. His goal was an ambitious one, to say the least, as it was catastrophic, and said goal was to seize specific tech set to unlock new pathways through the webway. However, it was understood such a theft would not go unnoticed or uncontested. His actions would lead a contingent of Blood Ravens, led by the ever-vigilant Captain Gabriel Angelos, to be deployed to Arcadia alongside, forming a rather tenuous, yet volatile, alliance with the Harlequin defenders of the world. Together they fought a brutal, yet fluid battle against Ahriman's warband, in which fractured geometries and anti-logic of the librarian's halls would confound and confuse. In the end, the Harlequins manipulated Ahriman, guiding him towards a false webway gate whose path led to nowhere. Ahriman, for all his foresight and cunning, was misled, as the true gateway would remain untouched for a time. It would be in 999 M41, where, despite the brief reprieve, things would go wrong once again, as now armed with the knowledge coerced from Inquisitor Brian Slaw Sevek, Ahriman finally achieved what no human had before: unauthorized entry into the Eldari webway. And this was because Zevek was the only sanctioned Imperial soul ever allowed inside the Black Library. This was due to him having been used by the Eldari as a living lore. His access was a strategic gambit designed to bait the arch-sorcerer. Unfortunately, this play failed. From the surface of Etinium 3, a planet once entrusted to the Imperium by the lost craft world Alstar, Ahriman's minions long unearthed a buried portal, the very one Hex had uncovered during the sacking of the aforementioned Reclusium. Through this portal, Ahriman breached the veil between real space and the ancient corridors of the webway. The intrusion sent shockwaves through the Eldari seer paths. The Farseers, despite their millennia of vigilance, had not foreseen this incursion. Their failure had forced the hand of Eldrad Ulthrain, Supreme Farseer of Ulthwé, as he was made to emerge from isolation in order to lead a desperate counteroffensive. The Order Psykana, a cabal of Bloodraven librarians, would also be deployed to reinforce the defense. Though they arrived too late to repel the invaders proper, they ultimately secured the defiled Reclusium and sealed this breach permanently. In 999 M41, Ahriman would appear once again, as years of unrelenting warfare within the webway did not diminish his resolve. Instead, they sharpened it. Now, deeper within the labyrinthian portals than any man should ever dare go, he resorted to a rare occult stratagem unlike any before. By projecting his astral self into the very heart of the Black Library, Ahriman bypassed the physical and metaphysical defenses, the Harlequins, the psychic wards, and the deathless guardians. While his true form remained beyond its threshold, his soul walked the forbidden stacks freely. Every sight, every glyph, every sigil, was instantaneously transmitted back to his corporeal vessel and transcribed by his own hand into hermetic parchment. Among the lore thus stolen was a singular prize, the Tome of the Labyrinthus, which was a conceptual map of secret pathways woven throughout the webway, believed to lead to both physical strongholds and metaphysical truth. With this act, Ahriman did not simply claim knowledge, he rewrote the limits of his pursuit himself. Later, in the same year, 999 M41, on the frontier world of Xanthamos, known for its obsidian mines and negligible imperial oversight, a psychic scream rang across the Imperium as an unrelenting, soul-deep wail that called to one attuned to suffering like a hound to blood. This was something Basilisk the Shrouded, a sorcerer lord of the Night Lords, would answer. Drawn by the resonance of terror, Basilisk led his warband into the mines with his legion's characteristic brutality, slaughtering the labor crews and letting fear blossom into psychic sustenance. Yet the horror did not end with the flesh. The anguished dead lingered, manifested as warpgeist, specters locked in their perpetual death throes, as screaming tones only sorcerers and the damned could ever hear. The true architect of the unfolding carnage was Hospit, now High Warlock of the Mind Eaters, a rival cabal of psykers enthralled to darker foresights. While Basilisk feasted upon the horror, Hospit enacted his 775th rite, a hex-bound trap encoded into the world's very crust. As the last echoes of life faded from the mines, Hotep sealed them shut. Then the dead ignited. Warp fire erupted from the tunnels, transforming the tortured spirits into a blazing vortex of psychic combustion. The cavern complex became a crucible of perpetual suffering, consuming the Night Lords entirely. When the mines were eventually breached by the Mechanica salvage teams, they discovered nothing but ash and vitrified bone, along with one object of dark fascination, a single shard of dark glass, pulsating faintly with residual psychic heat. Forensic psychers identified this object as Basilisk himself, fused and crystallized into a relic, now whispered to contain the echoes of his mind. This is the Shrouded Crystal. Once again, in 999 M41, from the ashes of betrayal, it seems purpose would rise once again. On the planet of the Sorcerers, the exiled son, Azek Ahriman, was summoned by none other than his Primarch, Magnus the Red. Their reunion had been long forestalled due to bitterness and pride. This meant that it was most definitely not sentimental. This reunion was strategic. Magnus, master of the immaterial and architect of vengeance, sought not an apology, but an alignment. He laid before Ahriman the framework of a plan, nay, rather a design for a galactic transformation, and requested his aid not as a subordinate, but rather as a peer. Though what passed between Gene father and son would only be known directly to them, what followed would be a change that would shift the Imperium forever. As fate turned its gaze northward in 999 M41, the Fenris system, the ancestral domain of the Space Wolves, was once more engulfed in warp storms and a seemingly coordinated demonic incursion. The Vulfin, once cast out and now returned, found themselves beset by the very hell they had long been shaped to fight. The Grey Knights and the Dark Angels deployed swiftly in order to reinforce the beleaguered Fenrisian system, but unity seemed to crumble under the cunning assault of not blade, bolt, or psychic attack, but rather of deceit. The demon, known only as the Changeling, servant of Tzeentch, sowed mistrust and confusion amongst the Astartes ranks, pushing the Imperial forces towards interscene conflict. It was the Grey Knights who discerned the true nature of the storm. The ancient symbols traced through the aether, recorded only in their oldest libriums, pointed towards Prospero, raised 10 millennia ago. It was the mark of vengeance, a curse reborn. Then came the Skyfire. Above Fenris, 9 silver towers blinked into existence, the floating fortresses of Tzeentch's own Thousand Suns, returning at last to avenge the destruction of their homeworld and carve out their own pound of flesh. From these impossible constructs poured out waves of Zangors, mutated cultists, and Rubric Marines, along with a litany of Scarab occult terminators. moving with inhuman precision across Fenris's ice-choked terrain. The arch-sorcerer Ahriman, now temporarily reconciled with Magnus, opened hidden webway portals, unleashing exiled Thousand Sons directly into the battlefield in coordinated psychic ambushes. Imperial resistance was scorched away in a tide of arcane fire. Yet this assault was not merely martial, it was a ritual. The Silver Towers aligned themselves with the geomantic nodes of planetary power. Within each tower, a captured space wolf was sacrificed in boiling gore as psychic energy funneled skyward. For 3 solar days, the planet burned with unnatural flames. When the veil between realities thinned, Magnus the Red strode into the Imperium. The demon Primarch, now flanked by Ahriman and a cadre of his most powerful sorcerers, initiated a planetary-scale rite. Fenris's crust cracked, and the magma beneath the fang boiled over. Once sacred and stable, it now seethed with demonic presence. Mutagenic surges twisted the land, and the fortress monastery itself threatened to collapse from within. Only the obliteration of Midgardia, a neighboring world, forced the Silver Towers' retreat. Yet their disappearance was not a victory, for the death of Midgardia was intentional. The psychic energy was harvested from its destruction in order to empower Magnus, giving him the final key to enact his still unfolding plan, its scope unknown to those within the conflict zone. However, its consequence would not yet be felt. Within the fortress monastery known as the Fang, which had been crippled by their previous assault, the Thousand Sons pushed forward across the scarred terrain of Fenris. Their march culminated in the natural choke point known as the Wolf's Gullet, a vast canyon carved through volcanic stone and ancient glaciers, steeped in the blood of earlier Fenrisian rites. It is here that the defenders of Fenris, the Sons of Rus, battle-worn and desperate, chose to make their final stand. Above the battlefield, the demon Primarch Magnus the Red loomed, surrounded by the flame and smoke of a world nearly destroyed. He descended with the wrath befitting a god reborn, his mind unleashing torrents of warp lightning that obliterated Astartes tanks and attack aircraft alike. His massive form, radiant with such arcane power that it became a beacon of despair to all those who faced it. In an act of defiance, Ilgian Ironwolf leveled a lascannon and fired directly at Magnus's cyclopean eye. But the Crimson King did not flinch. With the merest flicker of thought, he arrested the beam mid-flight, its energy still humming, still in the air, before translocating Egil into its path. The shot meant to slay a Primarch annihilated its own master. Egil's death was instantaneous and complete, as it served to be a cruel exclamation mark upon Magnus's new dominion. However, hubris had a price. This momentary lapse, this theatrical execution allowed Logan Grimnar himself, the great wolf of the Space Wolves, to strike. Seizing the opening, he drove the Axe Morkai, a demonic weapon of Khorne, blessed by the god of blood and skulls, to pierce through the Primarch's breastplate, shattering the wards woven by the blue scribes of Tzeentch, exposing the raw flesh of the demon beneath. Magnus would then reel, howling in rage and agony. Then came the Grey Knight Purifiers, chanting rites known only to the secretive chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus. They advanced with blades alight with white flame, ancient words pouring from their lips like molten silver. The fires themselves enveloped the Crimson King in a flash brighter than the Fenrisian sun. Magnus, his legion, and the demonic horde were forcibly then vanished back into the warp. For now the defenders of Fenris held the field, but across the stars, in the cold void beyond mortal perception, a new tremor stirred. The destruction of Murdergrad had not been without its consequence. Its death, violent and sacrificial, had empowered a rite of monstrous scale. The planet of the sorcerers, long hidden deep within the warp, tore into real space with a sundering roar, manifesting into orbit beside the ruins of Prospero. The once buried empire of Magnus now stood reborn, made real by death and magic, glaring at the galaxy as an ever-present moment of vengeance. Seated upon his floating throne, Magnus gazed outwards, unblinking disdain clear upon his features, as the galaxy he surveyed was not the one that had cast him down. The next important event that would involve the Thousand Sons in any way, shape, or form of galactic scale would also occur in 999 M41. As the warp-fueled storms of ambition swelled, Abaddon the Despoiler issued a call to unity, for the 13th Black Crusade had begun. Many other traitor legions had answered, but Magnus the Red, contemptuous of the War Master's ambitions, refused. His designs lay beyond Abaddon's reach. Yet Isaac Ahriman, ever calculating, saw an opportunity. Though Magnus remained aloof, Ahriman dispatched several thrall bands towards the ice moon of Classis, deep within the Cadia system. Ostensibly, this was a gesture of support. However, the move concealed a deeper intent. These forces were distractions, masking Ahriman's real ambitions, as he had foreseen that Classis would become a nexus of fate, a locus around which the schemes of Tzeentch might unfold. This was a masterstroke of misdirection, as the arch-sorcerer was playing 3 games at once. Meanwhile, within the shifting courts of Tzeentch's sorcerer cult, blood was spilled not for war, but rather for dominance, as the exalted sorcerer Krothopos, a veteran of the cult of magic, had spent over a millennium constructing a grand stratagem. His designs were precise, his ambitions undeniable, but his efforts were subverted by a rival, Hasopet, scion of the Mind Eaters. Humiliated, Carthropos challenged Hasopet to a psychic duel. What followed was not a clash of brute force, but cunning. Carthropos, vastly superior in raw psychic strength, unleashed waves upon waves of mind flame, searing bolts and mental anguish. But Hasopet had come prepared. In his left hand, he carried a dagger of reflections, an ancient relic acquired during his 87th rite, a weapon that shimmered with the capacity to redirect through itself almost any psychic attack. The flames of Carthopus' assault arced towards Hasopet, only to be drawn into the dagger and thereby reflected, then hurled back in crashing, cascading waves. The counterstrike obliterated the exalted sorcerer's mind in a flash of internal detonation. Blood and cerebral spinal fluid oozed from beneath his helm as he collapsed in a motionless heap. Before the corpse even hit the ground, Hasopet closed the distance and plunged the dagger into the downed sorcerer's ruined chest, carving out his still-beating twin hearts. These trophies marked the completion of Hasopet's 828th rite. As this was happening, within the ever-shifting fractal corridors of the webway, events began to converge that no Eldari Farseer had predicted, and no Imperial scholar would believe. At the heart of this convergence stood Isaac Ahriman, the exiled son of Prospero and the arch-sorcerer of the Thousand Suns. In the wake of Cadia's fall, the webway grew restless. Unseen by most demonic spirits, sealed across its winding arteries, began to report unusual activities. This in particular was amongst the Ynnari, the reborn cult of Yanid, the Eldari god of the dead. To Ahriman, these omens struck like a blade to the soul. The resurrection of fallen Eldari warriors presented not a threat, but a possibility. A mirrored hope for the Rubricae, the cursed remnants of his legion. Determined to test this hope, Ahriman led a detachment of Thousand Suns into the webway. This itself was a dangerous gamble, even for those most powerful of psykers. His destination was Psyche Delta, a convergence point in the webway's very shifting corridors and causeways. The Ynnari, unaware of the trap ahead, raced towards the ice moon of Classis, drawn by the events set in motion by the 13th Black Crusade. Before the ambush could be sprung, Ahriman performed a ritual of unspeakable cost. 999 captives were offered as sacrifices to Tzeentch. Each one would be consumed by a ritual of translocation, their souls burned to fuel Ahriman's crossing, catapulting his warband and demons thralls directly into the Ynnari's path. The battle that erupted was one of primal fury, as warp fire and scrolled bolts and Eldari blades of monomolecular precision clashed within the translucent tunnels. Yet amidst the chaos, Ahriman unveiled his true aim, as he tore open a pocket dimension and created a false realm hovering just outside the webway's boundaries. Into this constructed void, he pulled the triumphant of Yanid, Yvrain, and Visach, along with Yakir, hoping to unmake their spirits and extract their forbidden knowledge. But Yvrain, High Priestess of Yanid, did not break. Instead, she answered Ahriman's ambition with an act of defiance, resurrecting a dozen Rubricae Marines. The once hollowed suits of armor were now flesh and blood warriors. These sons of Prospero stood blinking, staggered by their return to life. For the first time in 10,000 years, they saw their sorcerers, not as an echo in the warp, but through living eyes of their own. Ahriman, overcome by grief, joy, and regret, unfortunately allowed sentiment to overcome instinct, as the triumphant pulled back from the webway before death could claim them, and before the magic wore off. Then a sudden rift tore open, as a wraith knight, towering and merciless, carved its way through the webway, its crystalline structure cracking under the pressure, sundering the tunnel and creating a gap in the void, where the arcane, avatar of the god of death, inhaled with a force beyond reason, as the newly resurrected Thousand Sons were dragged from their feet and swept into the abyss, vanishing into nothing. Not even the remnants of their souls remained. It was at this moment that Ahriman's screams echoed throughout the fracture. His victory had been turned to ash, yet from that agony bloomed a certainty. The Rubric of Ahriman could indeed be reversed, and now he knew who held the key. In 999 M41, within yet another theater of war, far from the ruins of Prospero and the haunted corridors of the webway, the galaxy shuddered anew. News reached Magnus the Red that his brother, Rubric Ahriman, had returned. The Primarch of the Ultramarines had been restored by unknown means, and he was making his way straight to Terra in order to commune with the Emperor himself. Magnus, perceiving this as a grievous threat, and perhaps a moment long prophesied, consulted with his ever-changing strands of fate. The Crimson King traced Ahriman's path throughout the Maelstrom, a region of the warp where turbulence affected the very laws of reality, and where existence began to dissolve into something else entirely. There, Magnus waited at the edge of madness when the Terran Crusade's fleet finally emerged. It was not met by welcome, but by a storm of heretical fire, as the Thousand Sons, warp-spawn constructs, and demon-haunted vessels launched their massed assault. With merciless timing, Ahriman's forces were outnumbered and surprised, but under his command they held firm. Then the Crimson King invoked the power of the warp itself. From the churning sea of unreality, tendrils of raw power lashed out, coiling around the Crusade fleet, not to destroy but to draw it in, deeper into the Maelstrom's heart. Magnus did not seek to kill his brother, at least not yet. Instead, he set him on his path, one shaped not by Imperial design but by Tzeentch's will. The future was now set in motion, not broken but bent. Magnus the Red had waited, but not idly, as his predatory patience gnawed at him, his gaze fixated on Rubric Ahriman, recently resurrected Primarch of the Ultramarines, who Magnus believed would tread the steps of destiny and emerge through the webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace. But fate was diverted. The Terran Crusade did not exit where the Crimson King had planned. Instead, Ahriman and his forces emerged upon Luna, the ancient moon of Terra. Despite the setback, Magnus surged forth, his forces breaching the veil between realms and thundering into Luna's crater-scarred surface. There, under the blazing gaze of Sol, and in the view of the Emperor's throne world, the Crimson King at last stood face to face with his brother. A twisted smile formed upon his mal-shaped face, not out of joy, but out of calculation and thrill of the impending retribution. It must also be noted that, like a coward, he did not come alone. As Rubric Marines, immaculately still, their souls yet in their dust-filled armor, marched up the steps beside Scarab occult terminators, their arcane plate pushing and pulsing with aetheric power. The air around them warped and screamed, as warp fire gouted across the lunar plains, interspaced with inferno bolts that turned reinforced armor into molten slag. Magnus himself had become the locus of psychic devastation and power within this area, his mere presence unraveling the reality of existence as his thoughts armored him and his followers in sigils of dread. Ahriman responded with singular focus. The Lord Commander of the Imperium, encased within the armor of fate, launched into a brutal brouhaha with fury and precision. The first blow of their clash caused tremors to be felt deep beneath the lunar surface, as ancient wreckage, remnants of wars long past, were cast aside like broken glass. Across the plains and craters they fought, Ahriman's every strike fueled by martial discipline and precise control, while Magnus, wielding the unchained might of the warp, responded in kind. This was a clash of titanic philosophies, as much as it was one of power. Amidst the chaos, the remnants of the Terran Crusade clung to survival. The Thousand Sun sorcerers unleashed phantasmal horrors and firestorms upon the beleaguered Imperial defenders, but all was not lost. Shadow Seer, Flyandary, Veilwalker, and Eldari of the mysterious Harlequin moved unseen through the chaos. Her objective was the webway portal Magnus had used to gain access to Luna. Even as the Thousand Suns warded it with intricate bindings, Veilwalker unraveled their glyphs with precise arcs of her masked sorcery. At the duel's climax, Guilliman struck with a force of righteous fury. Magnus, caught in the throes of the sorcerer's release beyond his control, answered with a searing psychic blast. As the two powers collided, the shockwaves that followed cast Magnus from Luna, flinging him back into the webway portal from which he had come, with such force that the veil of reality trembled. With no hesitation, Veilwalker sealed the webway gate behind him. Now trapped within the labyrinthian dimension, Magnus's howls of fury echoed throughout the unreal. What he had foreseen that day as a day of ruin for the Imperium had instead been stolen from him. But even in his rage, the Crimson King turned his sights forward as he saw a darkness gathering, a wound yet to be torn across a galaxy, one that would offer many more paths to the vengeance he so desired. It all began on the planet of the Sorcerers, there in that impossible realm suspended within the warp, yet confoundingly enough right next to Prospero. The unchecked sorceries of Magnus and his cultists had been building. Their baleful energies did not remain confined to the world itself, as they combined into swells of countless overlapping warp storms. The barriers between the immaterium and the materium began to give way. As the galaxy screamed, the Great Rift tore open across the stars, a chasm of raw chaos energy cleaving its way and ripping the galaxy in twain. It was not merely space that was sundered, but reality itself. Entire systems were swallowed up. Planets became altars of mutation, or were annihilated outright from existence. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that had unified the Imperium's navigators since the dawn of the Great Crusade, flickered and, at least momentarily, it died. This was the Noctis Aetherna, the Black Night. Throughout the Imperium, laughter and howls echoed, the sound of ancient powers exulting in victory. The veil between realms had been thinned to a mere breath. The Imperium was no longer whole, and the age of certainty was over, as the age of chaos ascendant had begun. No warning, no declaration, no threat of war. In a seemingly isolated corner of Segmentum Solar, a star Astartes began to flicker. The stellar fluctuations were not rare, but the perception of such a disturbance was suspect. The cult of manipulation, a Thousand Suns affiliated cabal, long suspected of high-order chromantic and technomantic rituals, had enacted a hex with a singular aim, snuffing out the Aphes star. What followed was not quite the death of celestial fusion, but the deliberate manufacturing of a solar storm, the likes of which disrupted long-range augur readings across Imperial sectors. It must be noted that this anomaly most definitely could not go unnoticed, as the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's golden sentinels, and perhaps the second greatest force protecting the Emperor himself, detected the surge and immediately mobilized. In response, a strike contingent was formed of Alaris custodians, accompanied by a litany of Grey Knights, and a sizable deployment of Skitarii from the Martian Legion. The mission was uncompromising: locate the cult, dismantle the hex, and purge every last heretic within the system. But as the Imperials closed in on the Astartes system, the trap was sprung. An enormous flare, likely provoked by the spellwork itself, erupted in an unnatural fury. The flare scattered the approaching forces, while the Grey Knights and Skitarii, through a mix of grit and guidance, located and shattered the profane, warp-anchored wards. Sustaining the spell, the custodians were less fortunate, as the flare's warp-charged shockwave cast them adrift, not merely in space, but within the immaterium. There, waiting with cruel precision, were the Thousand Suns, and much like countless other times, it seems the custodians would fall to what is supposedly lesser creations of the Emperor, as the custodians would never transmit again. Their bodies, their war gear, everything they were, disappeared. In the wake of Astartes' fall, another front ignited, this one within the Stygian sector, a heavily fortified yet isolated network of systems which had become the next target of Magnus the Red's ever-expanding campaigns. While the Astronomicon was veiled by the Great Rift. The Stygius system was a blind bastion, its defenders deaf to the warning and cut off from aid. That would be when chaos struck with pure undiluted ruthlessness. Cultist uprisings, dormant for decades, flared into planetary-scaled rebellion. Demonic incursions tore through thinly held void stations. Thrall bands, roving war bands of Thousand Suns and renegade allies struck simultaneously across key systems. This sector of the Imperium buckled as worlds fell in days. Resistance would come from two fronts: the iron-willed, ever-glorious Mordian Iron Guard. Such Mordian glory was rarely seen, yet their discipline is one of legend even amongst the Astra Militarum. This was aided with the sudden arrival of the Eldari's forces, operating under the cryptic banner of the Stygius Crusade. Their objectives remained unknown, their methods surgical, and their timing precisely as Magnus had foreseen. Some within the Ordo suspected the Eldari were not allies, but rather instruments, distracting, delaying, or diverting attention from parts of a broader strategy. As Stygius did not merely fall, it was reshaped, molded according to the pattern no Imperial tactician could decode in real time. The next event of note would occur in M42, deep within the gravity-wrecked stalagmite jungles of Carcodia, a planet known more for its biotithe than its strategic value. It was here that a different type of horror unfolded. There, amongst the native Ogren tribes, a hunting band brought down a mutated beast. This was a common enough occurrence that it originally raised no questions, but buried in its organs was a sac pulsating with a strange allure. Compelled by something that they did not understand, the hunters brought the object to their elders. The tribal council would quickly declare it good and place it at the heart of their settlement. As time passed, the sac began to emanate luminescent multi-hued lights, and eventually it split open, not with gore but with reverence. From within stepped a figure, radiant in appearance, not a monstrous entity nor a beast, but something divine, or so the Ogren believed. They wept in its presence as they worshipped it, and said worship would give way into transformation. As these tribes slowly began to morph, their brutish forms reshaped by unseen forces into warped reflections of their false idol. By the time the Astra Militarum arrived to collect their tithe, the Ogrens were no more. Now they were chaos spawn, prowling a world which was in essence unrecognizable in both biology and allegiance. The fate of the world was one of quarantine and study, as no official exterminatus decree was recorded. Yet another mystery still unsolved. As elsewhere, far from this world, from within the Fang, the space wolves of the Ergar Kingdom's great company launched a campaign long in the making, a strike directly against the planet of the Sorcerers, a chance to wound the Thousand Suns at their root. However, they would never arrive. Though experienced in warp navigation and hostile incursions, every attempt to reach Prospero's Phantom Echo was thwarted, as no matter the route, no matter the navigator, they were met with warp eddies that acted with both precision and a living will, shifting, unfolding, and cascading the great companies into parts and times unknown. No engagement, no transmission, just entire companies lost to only silence evermore. Also, during M42, within Gasima, an outpost world, cold, remote, and scarred, nestled within its windswept highlands, stood a fortified spire containing the covenant of the legendary Sisters of Silence, a bastion shielded not by voxnets or orbital guns, but by the sheer presence of the Null Maidens, the greatest force to ever directly protect the Emperor, greater even than their Aramite-covered counterparts. There, silence reigned, not from choice, but by nature. Then came the dust, a cloud of particulate matter, at first dismissed as a seasonal anomaly. It descended across the convent. The sisters, experienced in both war and warp-born deception, quickly recognized the threat, but even their vigilance could not prepare them for what followed. Meteoric impacts tore through the vaulted ceilings and sanctified walkways. No debris, not bombardment, but instead Rubric Marines, lifeless but deadly, rained down in their armor marked with sigils of the blades of Magnus. The strike was surgical and had a theatrical flair, falling from orbit with unerring accuracy, their bodies smashing into the sacred halls like divine hammers of Aetheric wrath. Then the air crackled. Atmospheric lightning burst forth from violent violent arc as the dust began to move. It was not mere ash, but psychoreactive particulate essence, the very souls of the Thousand Suns warriors, fragmented and waiting with unusual unity as the dust coalesced and surged forth towards the broken Rubric marine suit. The lifeless armor now stood, weapons raised in unison, and the Sisters of Silence resisted without hesitation, as every corridor became a sanctum of blood and ash. But the Rubric marines fought with a relentlessness bordering on the eternal, and unfortunately the Covenant would fall stone by stone. As their final sister was slain, the Thousand Suns unable to get her throat to utter even a single cry of pain. Then the spire went dark, becoming smoldering ruins. No survivors, no transmissions, no screams. Elsewhere, also during M42, the Silver Suns, a warband of Chaos Space Marines known for their obsession with temporal sorcery and post-human augmentation, found themselves in an escalating conflict with the Nefhet dynasty of the Necrons. Where others would retreat or fortify, the Silver Suns chose desecration. They unleashed a quartet of Helldrake, demon-bound monstrosities of twisted flesh and corroded ceramite upon the Tesseract Vault. This was a stasis prison crafted to contain shards of a star god. The vault's seals held for an hour, maybe a few days, but eventually they failed under the relentless assault, with the imprisoned shard of a Catan now loosened upon the galaxy. The shard did not hesitate, and what followed was not a skirmish or a campaign, but a cataclysmic rampage stretching across years of real space-time. The Nefket Tombworld would then be harvested of life and light, and even their phase shift reinforcements were torn apart by the starborn fury of the freed entity. The Silver Suns vanished shortly thereafter, consumed by their own gambit or transformed by it. The question of what happened remains unconfirmed, but there were a plethora of Thousand Suns sorcerers within that cabal. Significantly before this, in 999 M41, amidst the closing days of the 41st millennium, with the Tau Empire embroiled in a prolonged planetary engagement on Mangle 3, an unwelcome third front in this brouhaha emerged. The sorcerer Hasafut, commander of the Mind Eaters warband, entered orbit under false signal beacons. With a single stroke, he shattered the shrouded crystal, a relic of uncertain origin that had hung dormant in the system for centuries. Its fragments scattered into Mangle 3's upper atmosphere, casting the entire planet into a darkness so thick it defied augury and sight alike. Cut off from orbital relays and reinforcement, the Tau and Imperials would continue their bloody conflict, blind, deaf, and increasingly erratic. Now blind, deaf, and increasingly erratic. In the Veiled Sacrifice, the Mind Eaters began a ritual of colossal scale. Trophies from 998 previous rites were placed in a vast crescent. Fetishes of bone, teeth, memory skins, forming a lattice of psychic conductivity. At the center, Hasafut erected a pyre, crowned with the hearts of Crophos, a long-dead seer cult. He ignited it with their blood, and the reaction was immediate, as it created a vortex of psychic energy that surged into Hasafut, shredding the minds of hundreds of thousands instantaneously. The battlefield became a graveyard of blank-eyed soldiers, but the sorcerer's victory turned into horror. Rather than ascending into true demonhood, his body began to rupture. Grotesquely and rapidly, he was mutating into a mutilant vortex beast. Each life consumed further fed the transformation. Each memory devoured expanded the very vortex around him. War engines, regiments, even alien aircraft alike were drawn bloodily towards him. And then, Mangle 3 vanished entirely. The whole planet swept from real space, devoured by the psychic maelstrom. In its place now hangs a void-shrouded region of warp-thick space, from which light no longer escapes. Some say you can still hear Hasafut's final scream echoing faintly through the warp where the planet once spun. Back to M42. Across the breadth and depths of the Great Rift, ancient symbols carved in warp flame burned, clearing a path through the void. Psychic visions, terrible and lucid, gripped the minds of dozens of exiled Thousand Suns sects, some long presumed lost or consumed by their own sorcerous infighting. The message came not as an invitation, but as a command. It originated from Raheti, the cabal of Magnus's most trusted arch-sorcerers. The terms were stark: return and kneel or be destroyed by the will of their gene-sire. Of the 12 exiled groups, 11 complied. They emerged from hidden strongholds, dust-cloaked tomb ships, and fragmented worlds scoured by arcane fire. The final sect's fate is yet unrecorded. Likely it had been obliterated before its refusal could be etched into the fabric of time. 11 loyal retinues gathered on the planet of the Sorcerers, converging on the mustering grounds of Zika, where once stood the shining seat of Prospero's glory. Now only margins of its former grandeur remained, floating over the deserts and crushed crystals along with warped brass. There the Retaini began the rites of reunification, and it was a ceremony as much as it was a performance and a punishment. Beneath the shadow of the floating monoliths, the cyclopean pylons, the assembled armies stood in perfect alignment, their rubric marines and scarab occult terminators arranged in battle formations, yet still. The final act came at the altar of fate, a relic shrine of living warpstone and ever-burning flame. One by one, each living sorcerer amongst the exiles was called forth. From each were taken 9 drops of blood, dripped with ritual precision into the altar of fate. With that offering, fate was sealed. Then the silence was shattered. Without warning or visible command, the rubric marines of the 11 sects turned in flawless unison, their weapons raised, but not towards enemies beyond, but upon their own masters. Before a word of protest could leave the throats, or a single spell formed upon the tongue, the sorcerers at the altar were obliterated. No screams, no defiance, only fire and the cracking of psychic wards under terminal betrayal. From this act of orchestrated slaughter, a new order emerged. The exiles were no more. The Rubricae had absorbed their strength, purged their independence, and bound their rubric cohorts into a singular silent obedience. Currently, Ahriman, the arch-sorcerer of the Thousand Suns, remains a paradox, even to those who claim to know him, including his Primarch. For millennia, he has pursued a singular aim with unrelenting clarity, the reversal of the Rubric of Ahriman, the very spell that condemned his legion's warriors into hollow shells of dust and soul-bound armor. And now he might just have found a path, though that path seems to conflict with his own Primarch desires. Reports have filtered through the warp and demon-bound Astartes, speaking of Yevrain, prophet of the Yunari, and her ability to restore the rubric marine, if only briefly, to living flesh. The implications of this are staggering, and Ahriman's purpose, long ridiculed as impossible or misguided, has gained terrifying momentum, potentially even giving him enough credibility to supplant his Primarch as a leader of the Thousand Suns, as he has begun to summon his forces. Not for war, but for infiltration and acquisition. Magnus the Red, once betrayer, is now his reluctant ally, owing Ahriman a debt, one which he has sworn, through the principles of his demonic nature, to pay out. In this convergence of needs, the arch-sorcerer has made himself indispensable and too important, not just to Magnus, but to Magnus's very patron, Tzeentch, completely stopping any possibility of Magnus even thinking about assaulting him. As now, the Thousand Suns, Tzeentch, and Magnus's desires to assault the Black Library directly no longer seems like a madman's dream, but a veritable arcane campaign. Ahriman holds fast to the beliefs that chaos can be mastered, and that one should not be supplicant to their power, that with willpower, intellect, and vision, the tidal currents can be bent to mortal purposes. Though he is often crowned by others as a true chosen of Tzeentch, he refuses such titles, as he claims to serve no god, only his cause, further fueling the enmity between him and his Primarch. And yet, every step he takes, every spell he weaves, every war he ignites, all serve the changer of ways. Whether he sees it or not is a matter of debate, but what remains certain is this: Ahriman will risk the fabric of reality itself to walk the road towards his brother's resurrection and freeing them from all entities of war creation, even if turning their back on his Gene-Sire, even if in doing so he becomes the very doom of what he sought to once prevent. And so the stage is now set, with the psychic awakening for the Thousand Suns to once more reshape the galaxy in their image.